The door to Eliza Vane's farmhouse swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and the man who filled the frame was not a stranger. He was something worse. He was family, or what passed for family in the Vane name, which had always meant men who took and took until there was nothing left to take. "You're still here," Victor's voice carried no surprise. Only irritation, the way a man sounds when he finds a stray animal still sleeping on his porch. He looked at the bundle in her arms, the small, sleeping weight of 3-week-old Lillian, and something shifted in his expression. Not tenderness, calculation. "Put the child down," he said. "She stays. You don't." Eliza did not put the child down. She stood in the middle of the room her husband had died in, the room where she had labored alone for 11 hours because Victor had refused to send for a midwife, and she held her daughter tighter than she had ever held anything in her life. "Get out of my house," she said. Victor smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. "Your house." He let the words sit there. "Your husband borrowed against this land 3 times in his last year. Did he tell you that?" "No, I don't suppose he did. He borrowed against it, and when he couldn't pay, he signed it back to the family trust, which means it belongs to me now." He reached into his coat and removed a folded paper. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it up, the way you'd hold up a deed to a dog. "You have until morning." That was the moment. Not the moment she ran. Not the moment she wrapped her infant daughter in 2 wool blankets and slipped out the back before the sun was fully up. Not even the moment. She looked over her shoulder at the only home she had ever known and made herself stop looking, because if she kept looking, she would stop moving. The moment was when she realized Victor was not bluffing. He had prepared for this. He had timed it. He had waited until she was 3 weeks postpartum, until the grief of losing Thomas was still fresh enough to make her slow, until the baby was too new to travel comfortably and too fragile not to. He had chosen the worst possible moment on purpose. And that was when Eliza Vane understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just run out of options, that the only way to survive Victor Crane was to disappear before he could finish what he started. If you've ever felt like the ground was pulled out from under you the moment you had the least strength to stand, then you already know what Eliza felt that morning. Before we go any further, if this kind of story stays with you, if it makes you feel something, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And make sure you follow along to the end, because what happens next is not what anyone expected. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The storm had been building since noon, and by the time Rhett Hawthorne reached the northern ridge of his property, the sky had turned the particular shade of gray that old ranchers recognized not as a warning, but as a verdict. It was not going to snow later. It was snowing now, just waiting for the wind to agree. Rhett had made this ride 100 times. 4 miles from the grazing flats back to the ranch house, past the frozen creek, up through the tree break, down the far side where the trail narrowed and the pines leaned close enough to brush his shoulders. He could do it half asleep. He had done it half asleep more than once in the years since the ranch had become the only thing in his life worth maintaining. He was not a man who thought much while riding. That was the point of it. But he pulled his horse up short before the trail narrowed, because there was something wrong with the light ahead, and his instincts were sharper than his thoughts. He squinted through the snow. There was a figure standing on the trail, not moving, not waving, just standing, slightly off to one side, near the base of a pine tree that had dropped most of its branches in a windstorm 2 seasons back. The figure was small, smaller than he first registered, and it was holding something against its chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they cannot afford to drop. Rhett nudged his horse forward slowly. The animal didn't resist, which meant it wasn't afraid, which meant the figure ahead wasn't doing anything unpredictable. He kept one hand loose on the reins and one eye on the tree line, because you didn't survive 41 years in Montana territory by assuming a stranger on a winter trail was just a stranger. He stopped about 10 yards out. "You lost?" he called. The figure turned. It was a woman. Young or youngish. The cold had a way of making it hard to tell. Her coat was too thin for this weather, the kind of thing you'd wear to walk to a neighbor's house, not to travel any real distance. Her hair had come half loose from whatever she'd pinned it with, and one side of it was plastered against her face from the snow and probably from sweat. She was shaking. Not the fast, uncontrolled shaking of someone panicking, but the deep structural kind that happens when a body has been cold for too long and is starting to forget what warm felt like. And she was holding a baby. Rhett sat very still for a moment. He had not expected the baby. "I'm not lost," the woman said. Her voice was steadier than he would have expected from someone who looked like she did. "I know where I'm going. I just don't know how far." "Where are you going?" She hesitated, just briefly, but he caught it. "South," she said, "away from Gristle Flats." He recognized the name, small settlement, 30 miles north-northwest. He'd been there twice, both times for things he didn't particularly want to remember. "You walked from Gristle Flats?" "Most of it." 30 miles, in this weather, with an infant. Rhett got down from his horse. He didn't make a production of it, didn't move quickly, didn't say anything. He just climbed down and tied the reins to the nearest branch and walked toward her at a pace that gave her plenty of time to back up if she wanted to. She didn't back up. Up close, she was in worse shape than she'd looked from the trail. Her lips had gone gray at the edges. The bundle against her chest was wrapped in 2 blankets, both of them damp, and she had tucked the outer flap of her coat around the outside of the bundle to add one more layer of insulation, which meant her own core was exposed to the wind. She had been using her own warmth to keep the baby alive. "How long have you been standing here?" he asked. "I needed to rest." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. Hers were dark and very direct, and there was something in them that he didn't have a name for right away. Not fear exactly, not defiance exactly. Something in between, the look of a person who has decided they are not going to apologize for still being alive. "Long enough that I wasn't sure I should keep going," she said. He looked at the baby. The blankets were rising and falling faintly. Alive then. Barely old enough to have a name. "Can I see?" he asked. She didn't answer, but she shifted the bundle slightly so he could see the face inside. A newborn, clearly. 3 weeks old at most. Eyes closed, cheeks chalky pink from cold, one tiny fist pressed against its chin. Rhett had not looked at an infant that small in a very long time. He made himself look away. "My ranch is about 1.5 miles east," he said. "You can walk it or ride. Your choice." The woman stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No. I have no reason to trust you." "No," he said again. "You don't." A long pause. The wind moved through the pines above them, dropping a small shower of snow off the branches. The horse shifted its weight and exhaled a long breath that steamed in the cold air. "Is there anyone else there?" she asked. "No." "Anyone coming?" "Not in this weather." She looked at him for another few seconds. Then she looked down at the bundle in her arms, and whatever calculation she was running in her head, whatever measure of risk and necessity she was doing, he could see the moment it finished. "I can walk," she said. "The horse is easier." "I can walk," she said again, and the way she said it told him this wasn't stubbornness. It was the last piece of control she had left, and she was not ready to hand it to a stranger, even one offering help. He understood that better than he expected to. "All right," he said. He untied the horse and took the reins and walked ahead of her so she wasn't watching her own back the whole time. "It's a straight east. Follow the fence line when you see it." Her name was Eliza Vane. She told him that much, and nothing else, for the first half-mile. She walked with her head down into the wind and both arms locked around her daughter, and Rhett led the horse a little to her left to block some of the worst gusts. He didn't try to fill the silence. He had lived alone long enough that silence didn't bother him. It was when they came through the tree break and the fence line appeared out of the white that she spoke again. "The baby's name is Lillian," she said. He glanced back. "After her father," Eliza added, and then pressed her mouth shut the way people do when they've said something they didn't plan to. He turned forward again. "All right," he said. They didn't speak again until the ranch house appeared. He had not had a fire going when he left that morning, so the house was cold in the way that empty houses get cold. Not sharp like outside, but stale and still and slightly worse, somehow, than the open air. He got the stove going first while Eliza stood near the door holding Lillian, still not sitting, still not putting her arms down. He didn't tell her to make herself comfortable. He figured she would, or she wouldn't, on her own terms. He put water on, found the extra blankets from the chest under the window, and set them on the chair closest to the stove without handing them to her, just close enough that she could reach them without asking. When he turned back from the stove, she had finally sat down. She was still holding Lillian, but she'd unwrapped one of the outer blankets and was running her fingers across the baby's face, slow and careful, the way you check something you've been afraid to look at directly. Lillian's eyes were open now. Dark eyes, unfocused, the way newborn eyes are. She made a small sound. Eliza exhaled. It was the first time since he'd found her on the trail that the woman had looked like something other than sheer will holding a body upright. Rhett busied himself with not watching. He got down 2 mugs. He put coffee on. He found the last of the salt pork in the cold box and started cutting it, not because she'd asked for food, but because she needed it, and doing something with his hands kept him from trying to figure out what to say. He had not had another person in this house in over 2 years. The last person had been his brother, who had come to tell him about Margaret, and then left as soon as the telling was done, which was probably the right thing, but hadn't felt like it. He put the skillet on the stove and didn't think about that. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, not turning around. "If you're wondering." Silence. Then, "Most people ask. Most people are nosy." He moved the salt pork around the pan. "You need shelter, and your daughter needs warmth. That's the part that's my business. The rest isn't." Another silence, longer this time. "There's a man," she said. "He'll come looking." Rhett kept his eyes on the pan. "Who is he?" "My late husband's brother. His name is Victor Crane." She said the name like something she'd been carrying in her back teeth for weeks. "He has men, and he has a piece of paper that he claims gives him the right to take my daughter." "Does it?" "No." No hesitation. None. "It's forged, or close enough to it. My husband Thomas left the land to me in his will. Victor was not mentioned. He's been contesting it since Thomas died, but contesting is not the same as owning." Rhett turned around. He leaned against the counter and looked at her, really looked, for the first time since they'd walked through the door. She was watching him back. Not nervous exactly, testing, trying to read how he would react to what she'd just told him. He had known men like Victor Crane. Not this particular man, but the type. Men who wrapped theft in legal language and called it order. Men who understood that a woman alone with an infant, exhausted, grieving, afraid, was easier to break than a locked door. "You walked 30 miles in a blizzard with a newborn to get away from a man with a piece of paper," he said. "Yes." "That paper," he said, "is it the kind that would hold up in front of a judge?" She didn't flinch. "I don't know. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money for one. What I have is the original will, which I kept, and testimony from Thomas's doctor, who was present when it was signed." She paused. "I also have a daughter who is 3 weeks old and alive, which is more than Victor wanted." Rhett let that sentence land where it would. He turned back to the stove and moved the pork off the heat. "You can have the back room," he said. "There's a cot. It's warmer than the front." Another silence. "I'll work," she said. "I'm not asking for charity." "I didn't say you were." "I can cook. I can repair things. I'm good with animals. I'm not—" She stopped herself. Tried again. "I'm not useless." He turned to face her one more time. "I know," he said. "I watched you walk 1.5 miles in a storm on sheer spite. I'm not worried about useless." She looked at him. For a half-second, something in her face shifted. Not quite humor, but the ghost of it. Something that had probably been a quick smile once, before whatever the last few months had done to her. "Rhett Hawthorne," she said, not quite a question. "That's right. I'm Eliza Vane." "I know, you told me." She looked down at Lillian, who had fallen back to sleep against her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't answer. He got out the second plate. The storm outside built to its peak somewhere around midnight, and Rhett sat up by the stove long after the house had gone quiet, listening to the wind work itself against the walls. He was not a man who slept easily, and tonight was not going to be the exception. He sat with his coffee gone cold and thought about a man named Victor Crane he had never met, carrying forged documents through the territory to claim a child from its mother. He thought about the way Eliza had said no when he asked if the document was real. Not, "I don't think so," or "I hope not." No. Flat and certain. The way a person sounds when they know the truth but have been told their version of it doesn't count. He fed another piece of wood into the stove. From down the hall, through the wall of the back room, he heard the small sound of an infant. Not crying, just present. The tiny audible proof of something alive that had almost not been. He closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. He did not sleep. But he stayed there until the fire burned down, and the storm outside slowly quieted, and the silence that settled over the ranch was different from the one he had woken up to that morning. Heavier, maybe, or fuller. He wasn't sure there was a difference. What he was sure of, and he didn't spend much time questioning it, was that whatever Victor Crane was planning to do next, he was going to have to come through here to do it. And Rhett Hawthorne had not opened his door to let a woman die in his hallway. He had opened it because the alternative was worse. He was not sure yet what that meant. He fell asleep in the chair before he could figure it out, and the ranch sat quiet around him in the last hours of the storm, holding its two new occupants like something that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this. He was gone before she woke up. Eliza knew this not because she heard him leave, but because the house had a particular quality of quiet that only happens when you're alone in it. She had learned to read that quiet the way some people read weather, by the texture of it, by what it didn't contain. She lay on the cot in the back room with Lillian tucked against her side and looked at the ceiling for a long moment before she moved. The ceiling had a water stain in one corner shaped like nothing in particular. There was a crack along the beam above the window that had been filled with something, clay, maybe, or old pitch, and filled badly, so the repair was visible but functional. The kind of fix a man makes alone, with whatever he has, without anyone to tell him it looks sloppy. She sat up slowly. Her body still hurt in ways she was learning to expect, the kind of hurt that postpartum brought that no one warned you about clearly, because it wasn't dramatic, just constant, a low grinding ache that reminded her every morning that she had done something enormous, and her body hadn't finished understanding it yet. Lillian was awake and quiet, which was how she'd been since she was born. Not a silent baby, not fussy, just watchful. Dark eyes that tracked the ceiling, the window, Eliza's face, like she was cataloging things. Thomas had been that way too, observant first, verbal later. Eliza pressed her nose to the top of Lillian's head and breathed in. Then she got up. The back room was small but not uncomfortable. There was the cot, a wooden chest that she hadn't opened because it wasn't hers to open, a single hook on the wall with no coat on it, and a window that looked out onto a flat stretch of nothing in particular. A yard, bare ground, a fence post she could see had been mended 3 different times. Through the window the sky was white and pale, and the snow from the night before had settled flat and still. The storm had passed. She found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee. Not fresh coffee. Coffee that had been made earlier and left on the back of the stove to keep from going cold entirely, the way a person does when they're not sure if someone else is going to want it, or when. She poured herself a cup and stood at the window over the dry sink and looked out at the yard. Rhett was at the fence line. She could see him from here, about 60 yards out, doing something with the top rail of the fence near the first gate. Not repairing it, or not yet. Examining it, the way you examine something before you decide whether it's worth fixing or whether you pull it down and start over. He had his hat pulled low, and his back was angled slightly away from the wind that was still moving across the flat from the northwest. He didn't look up at the house. She watched him for about 30 seconds. Then she put the coffee down, wrapped Lillian in the warmer of the 2 blankets, tucked her into the wooden crate she'd lined with her spare shirt. She had found the crate herself, empty, under the dry sink, and determined it was the right size without asking, and started on breakfast. She did not ask permission. She simply looked through what he had, decided what she could make with it, and made it. It was the only way she knew how to function in a space that wasn't hers. Fill it with something useful before anyone could ask what you were doing there. She found dried beans, salt pork, half a sack of cornmeal, 3 eggs in a clay pot on the shelf, and some hard biscuits that were past their best but not past eating. She got the stove hot and started the eggs and warmed the biscuits in the pan beside them. She found a second plate without looking too hard. She set the table, 2 places, and then stood back and looked at what she'd done and felt, briefly and against her better judgment, like a woman setting up a household. She pushed that thought away. She heard him before she saw him, the knock of the back door, the specific sound of boots being knocked against the step to get the snow off. Then the door opened and he came in, and the temperature in the kitchen shifted the way it always does when someone comes in from outside cold. He stopped when he saw the table. She kept her eyes on the pan. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I said I'd work," she said. "Cooking is work." A pause. She heard him hang his coat on the hook near the door. "Eggs," he said. "You had 3. I used 2. The third is for later if you want it." He sat down without making a production of it, which she appreciated. Some men would have argued, some men would have made a show of being gracious about it, which was its own kind of burden. He just sat and ate, and the only sound for a few minutes was the scrape of forks and the wind outside finding the gaps in the window framing. Midway through the meal, she realized she was hungry, actually hungry, in a way that had been blunted by exhaustion and cold and fear. For so long she'd stopped recognizing it. She ate more than she expected to. "Fence needs work," she said. "It does. Top rail on the east side sitting crooked. Looks like the post shifted." He looked at her for just a second. "You can see the east fence from the back window. I looked out the front this morning when I got up. You can see 3 fence lines from the porch." He turned back to his plate. "Post heaved in the freeze. I'll reset it when the ground softens." "The rail will keep moving until you do." "I know." She let it go. They ate. The first full day passed in a rhythm that neither of them designed. Rhett worked outside. She could track him by the sounds that came through the walls, the particular rhythm of someone who is used to doing things alone. Hammering. The squeak and shudder of the barn door. The low sound of his voice, which she realized eventually was not talking to himself but talking to the animals, the way stockmen do. Not for the animals' benefit, but for their own. A way to stay present, a way to fill up the quiet without admitting you're filling it. Eliza worked inside. She organized the kitchen shelves, which had been arranged by someone who clearly restocked things wherever they fit, rather than by any logical system. She moved the coffee to the shelf nearest the stove. She put the cornmeal at the bottom where it wouldn't risk knocking onto anything lit. She found a seam in the flour sack that was splitting and stitched it with thread she found in a small tin near the window, then put the tin back exactly where it had been. She fixed 2 of the 3 chair legs that wobbled, using wedges of scrap wood she found near the kindling box. She aired out the blankets that had been in the chest under the front window, because they smelled like they'd been closed in too long. She did all of this with Lillian in the crate or against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from one of her own shifts, and she told herself it was only practical. Keeping her hands free was practical, and not that she needed the weight of her daughter against her sternum to think clearly. When Rhett came in at midday, he noticed. She could see him notice. His eyes moved across the kitchen in that particular way that men's eyes move when something is different and they're deciding whether to comment on it. He didn't comment. He got himself water, drank it standing up, looked at the chairs as he walked past them, and then went back out. She found herself exhaling after the door closed. She hadn't realized she'd been holding anything in. The trouble started on the second evening. Not external trouble. Not Victor Crane arriving with his hired men. Not any of the things she'd been braced for since she walked out of her house in Gristle Flats with her daughter and her husband's will tucked into her coat. The trouble was internal, small, the kind of trouble that sneaks up in the quiet. She had put Lillian down in the crate after the evening feeding and was standing at the dry sink washing the supper dishes when she heard Rhett stop in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around. "You don't have to do the dishes," he said. "You said that about breakfast too." "I meant it both times. And I keep doing it anyway." A pause. "You're not going to stop," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Probably not." She heard him sit down. The chair she had fixed, she could tell by the sound, no wobble. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Before the trail?" She kept her hands in the water. "South. There's a town called Ferris Bend, about 40 miles down. I have a cousin there, Clara. We haven't spoken in 3 years, but she's the kind of person who would let me in, I think." "You think?" "I don't know for certain. We didn't part on bad terms. We just stopped writing." She paused. "I was going to ask her to help me get to a land office, or a county courthouse, somewhere with records. Thomas's will needs to be filed properly before Victor can file his claim, and if he gets there first—" She stopped. "He files first and you're contesting instead of defending," Rhett said. She turned then. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, not looking at her but not looking away, which was somehow more honest than either. "You know land law," she said. "I know what I had to learn." He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. Ferris Bend is 40 miles south. The closest land office is 60 east, in Cutter's Creek. "I know. But Cutter's Creek requires a lawyer to file or a male co-signer. I don't have either." "Ferris Bend doesn't require either." "The judge in Ferris Bend is Emmett Harlow. He was a friend of Thomas's, and he's seen the original will. He can certify it." She paused again. "That's the plan, if you're asking about the plan." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable plan," he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. She turned back to the dishes. "You can stay until the snow clears enough to travel," he said. "The East Pass is blocked until it does. No point in trying the trail again." "I'm not trying the trail again," she said. "I learned that lesson." "What you did on that trail wasn't a lesson. It was a catastrophe you survived." She set the last dish on the shelf and dried her hands on the cloth hanging from the hook and turned around fully. "I know what I did," she said quietly. "I know how close it was. You don't have to explain it to me." He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "I'm not explaining it," he said. "I'm saying you don't have to do it again. Not from here." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said nothing, and after a moment he got up and went to check the stove, and the conversation was over, or as over as a conversation gets when it's left a residue. She picked up Lillian from the crate and sat in the chair near the window and looked out at the dark and tried not to feel grateful in a way that frightened her. By the fourth day, Lillian had developed an opinion about Rhett Hawthorne. It happened by accident. Eliza had been carrying Lillian while trying to bring in wood from the back stack, and the weight of the wood and the baby together was more than she could manage cleanly, and Rhett was standing 3 feet away and he simply held out his hands without asking. She hesitated. She noticed herself hesitate. And then she passed Lillian over. He held the baby the way men hold babies when they haven't held one in a while. A little stiff, a little formal, both hands engaged in a way that communicated he was taking the weight seriously. Lillian looked up at him with the focused attention she gave most things, that dark-eyed cataloging, and then she made the small sound she made, not quite a sound, more of an exhalation with shape to it, and something in Rhett's face went very still. Not the stillness of a man hiding something, the stillness of a man trying to hold something together that had just been struck. He looked at Lillian for about 4 seconds. Then he looked away. Eliza took the wood inside and didn't say anything, and when she came back out, he passed Lillian back to her with careful hands and went to the fence line without looking back. That evening, she asked him about the empty room. She hadn't meant to. It had been in her head since the first morning when she'd walked past the door on the way to the kitchen and noticed it was closed while every other door in the house stayed open. She had not opened it. That wasn't her place. But she had noticed it. "You don't have to answer," she said. She was feeding Lillian, sitting by the stove, and Rhett was cleaning a piece of harness at the table. "What's the question?" "The room down the hall, the closed one." His hands didn't stop moving. "It's a room." "I know it's a room." A pause. "I had a family," he said, finally. Not a complete one. It was in the early stages of being a family. "My wife, Margaret. We'd been married 2 years. She was—" He stopped. Started again. "She was expecting. We fixed the room up in the fall. She picked the colors." Eliza waited. "She died in January," he said. 4 years ago, the baby with her. A boy." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved over the roof. "I'm sorry," Eliza said. "Not the way people say it to fill silence. The way you say it when you mean it and don't have anything better." He nodded once. "I didn't change anything in the room," he said. "I've thought about it. I leave it closed." "That's not wrong," she said. He looked at her. "That's not wrong," she said again. "Leaving it closed. It's yours to leave closed for as long as you need." He looked back at the harness. "It bothered me," he said slowly, "when I held the baby." "I know. Not in a bad way. Or not only in a bad way." She understood what he meant. She had lived in the same house as grief long enough to know it didn't always feel like loss. Sometimes it felt like pressure, like the space where something should be was pressing back, not because it was empty, but because some part of you remembered what full felt like. "Lillian does that to people," she said quietly. She's small and she's difficult to ignore. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. She looks like she's taking notes, he said. She is. Eliza looked down at her daughter, who had in fact fallen asleep mid-feeding, one tiny fist pressed to her own cheek. Thomas was like that. He'd watch something for 20 minutes before he'd say a word about it. She said Thomas's name and didn't break. She was getting better at that. Not because it hurt less, but because she had learned to let it land and keep moving. You didn't get to stop. That was the whole lesson of the last 2 months, compressed into something she was still figuring out how to live with. He sounds like a decent man, Rhett said. He was. She readjusted Lillian against her. He was also stubborn and proud, and he kept things from me he should have told me. The debt, for instance. I didn't know how bad it was until Victor showed up with that paper. He was the kind of man who thought protecting someone meant sparing them. He meant well. Meaning well doesn't always help. No, she said. It doesn't. They sat with that for a while. Chab. On the 6th day, Eliza found the loose board. It was in the kitchen floor, near the leg of the work table, the kind of board that had worked itself up over years of being walked on, and had finally gotten to the point where the nail was more suggestion than fastening. She found it by nearly catching her heel on it, which would have been a bad fall with Lillian in her arms. She caught herself on the table edge and stood there for a moment, letting her heart slow down. Then she found a hammer. She was on her hands and knees when Rhett came in. "What are you doing?" "Nailing this down," she said. She fitted the nail against the board and drove it in. Once, twice. You would have stepped on it in the dark one of these nights and gone down. I know about that board. Then why? I've been meaning to fix it. She looked up at him. He had that expression he got sometimes when he was not quite ready to explain himself. Not defensive, just private. "You have a list," she said. "Don't you? Things you've been meaning to do." He didn't answer. "How long is the list?" A pause. "Long," he said. She turned back and drove the nail flush. "You live alone too long," she said, not unkindly, "and things get into a habit of staying broken. You stop seeing them. They're just part of what the place looks like." He was quiet. She sat back on her heels and looked at the floor, solid. "What else is on?" she asked. "Eliza, I have to do something while the pass is blocked," she said. "It's that or I'm going to rearrange your shelves again." A long pause. "The hinge on the barn door," he said, against what was clearly his better judgment. "The chimney needs clearing before the next hard freeze. The water trough in the south pen has a crack on the inside of the basin I've been pitching over with clay. Is the clay holding? For now. Show me where you keep the pitch." "Eliza." She looked at him. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I'm a woman who is going to be here for several more days and who cannot stand to watch things that should be fixed stay broken when I have 2 hands and the sense to use them." She paused. "Let me be useful, please." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her where the pitch was. The chimney was the project that took the most time, because it required him to go up on the roof, which she did not like, not because she thought he would fall, but because she couldn't do anything useful from the ground except hold the ladder and look up. And her to manage the flue from inside, and the communication required for that turned out to be more complicated than either of them anticipated. He would call something down, and she would call something back, and half of it was lost to the wind. And at one point she said something he clearly misheard as something else. And he started laughing up there on the roof. She could hear it, a real laugh, rough and unpracticed, like he was remembering how. And she stood below, not quite sure what was funny, but something loosening in her chest at the sound of it anyway. He came down from the roof, red-faced from the cold, and still almost smiling, and she handed him the coffee she'd brought out and said, "I still don't know what was so funny." And he said, "I'll tell you sometime," which was the most she'd gotten out of him since the conversation about Margaret, and she filed it away without examining it. That night, Lillian cried for the first time. Not a gentle complaint, but a real cry, pitched and insistent, the kind that gets into the walls and won't be absorbed. Eliza had her and was walking with her, the kitchen, the hall, the kitchen again, trying the various positions and rhythms that sometimes helped, and nothing was helping, and she knew it was probably nothing more than a gas pain working through a system too new to handle it efficiently, but she could feel the anxiety in her own chest lining itself up with Lillian's distress. She heard Rhett's door open. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his shirt and suspenders, hair not quite put together, looking at her in the way people look when they're not sure whether their presence helps or adds to the problem. "She all right?" "Fine," Eliza said, meaning it and not meaning it simultaneously. "She's fine, I can't find the position." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came into the kitchen, and he held out his hands again, and she gave him Lillian the same way she had at the woodstack, with that brief hesitation and then trust. He held Lillian against his chest, upright, her cheek against his collarbone, and he started walking. Just walking, back and forth across the kitchen, a slow, deliberate rhythm that didn't vary. He didn't look at Eliza. He kept his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and he walked. And after about 2 minutes, 2 long minutes in which Eliza stood near the stove with both arms suddenly empty and no idea where to put herself, Lillian's crying dropped to a hiccup, and then another, and then silence. Rhett kept walking anyway, just to be sure. Eliza stood and watched him and tried to work out what was happening in her chest. It wasn't romantic, she told herself. Or it wasn't only that. It was something more complicated. It was watching a man who had buried a son hold a living child, and the way he did it, careful and deliberate, and without making it mean anything out loud, made something in her ache in a way she didn't have good language for. He brought Lillian back to her after another few minutes. The baby was fully asleep. "Thank you," Eliza whispered. He nodded and went back to his room, and she stood in the kitchen in the quiet with her sleeping daughter and the fire burning low in the stove, and told herself that she was not going to complicate this, that she was going to Ferris Bend as soon as the pass opened, that this was a temporary shelter and this man was a stranger, and she needed to remember that. She told herself all of that very clearly. Then she sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the dark and found she had already stopped believing the temporary part. The 9th day brought the first real test. It was not Victor, not yet. It was something smaller, but in some ways more honest. She had gone out to the barn to look at the injured hinge on the door, as she had said she would, and while she was there she had taken stock of the animals. 4 horses, a pair of mules, 8 cattle she could see in the near pen, and found one of the horses standing wrong in its stall. Not lame exactly, but guarding something, weight shifted to 3 legs with the 4th barely grazing the floor. She ran her hands down the leg. She found the problem. A stone had worked up under the shoe and been there long enough to leave the hoof bruised but not obsessed. She found his tools on the wall. She had not shod a horse since she was 16, working on her father's farm in Nebraska. But the body remembers things the mind can categorize later, and she got the stone out and cleaned the hoof and packed it with what she found in his kit, and the horse settled its weight back evenly before she was finished. When Rhett came in from the far field and found her washing her hands at the barn trough, he looked at the horse and then at her. "She was favoring it," Eliza said. "I saw her this morning. I was going to look at it this afternoon." "Well," she dried her hands, "it's done now." He walked over to the horse, ran his own hand down the same leg, checked the packing she'd done. He didn't say it was good work. He didn't say anything. But when he straightened up and walked past her toward the barn door, he paused. "My brother used to say," he started, and then seemed to decide something, "that when something's already done right, the only thing to say about it is nothing." She looked at him. He walked out. She stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horse and cold stone and felt, unexpectedly, like she had been given something. Not a compliment exactly. Something with more weight than that. It was the 12th day when she found the photograph. She was not snooping. She had been cleaning the front room, which Rhett had told her she didn't need to do and she had done anyway, and one of the books on the shelf had slipped forward when she dusted behind it, and a photograph had fallen out from between the pages. She picked it up. A woman. Young, probably mid-20s, dark hair pinned back, a face that was not classically beautiful, but was interesting in the way that faces become interesting when there's a particular quality of personality behind them. She was looking at the camera straight on, not smiling, but not smiling, and she was holding something against her stomach with both hands. Not a baby, not yet, something softer. She was visibly expecting. Eliza understood immediately who this was. She replaced the photograph between the same pages of the same book and pushed the book back and straightened the shelf and did not mention it. But she thought about it for the rest of the day. About what it meant to keep something that painful in the pages of a book on a shelf, within reach, somewhere between a memorial and a reminder. Not locked away. not displayed, just present, quietly present. She thought about what it cost a man like Rhett to hold a living child at midnight while carrying something like that. She thought about it, and she didn't have a clean conclusion, and she let it sit unresolved the way some things have to. The pass opened on the 14th morning. She knew before he told her. The quality of the light was different, and the sound that came off the snowpack was different, and she had grown up in a part of the country where you learned to read these things before anyone said them out loud. She was in the kitchen when he came in from checking the trail. "East Pass is clear," he said. "Should hold for at least a few days if the temperature stays up." She nodded. She was folding Lillian's clean linens. She had washed them the day before, and she kept folding. "I'll be ready by morning," she said. A pause. "Ferris Bend is 40 miles, he said. "In this cold, with the baby. 2 days, maybe less if the trail's clear all the way through." "I know." "I can take you." He said it like it was a logistical statement, which she suspected was deliberate. She set down the folded linen. "You don't owe me that," she said. "I know I don't." "Have you already taken 2 weeks of your Eliza?" She stopped. "I'm not offering because I owe you," he said. "I'm offering because it's 40 miles in the cold with an infant and a man named Victor Crane somewhere on the same territory." He paused. "Those are practical reasons." She looked at him. He looked back. "All right," she said. She turned back to the linens. She did not let herself think about the fact that practical reasons and actual reasons are sometimes the same thing, and sometimes they are not, and she was not sure yet which kind these were. She folded the last cloth and stacked them neatly and told herself she would figure it out on the road. Outside, the sky had gone from white to a pale, watery blue, the color it turns when the worst of the cold has broken and the world is not warm yet, but is remembering the direction of warm. It was enough for now. She picked up Lillian from the crate and held her close and looked out the kitchen window at the ranch that had kept them for 14 days, and thought that some places get into you before you've decided to let them. This had been one of those places. She did not let herself wonder if it was the place or the man who kept it. At least, not yet. They left before sunrise, not because Rhett had told her to be ready early, and not because Eliza had set any particular time. It was simply the hour they were both awake. Her because Lillian had eaten and gone back to sleep and she had not. Him because he had slept no more than 4 hours in a stretch since Margaret died, and 4 years had done nothing to change that. They found each other in the kitchen in the dark, both of them already dressed, and the only thing either of them said was Rhett asking if she wanted coffee before they went, and her saying yes. The trail out of the ranch was clear enough in the pre-dawn dark. The snow had compacted into a surface that held the horse's weight without breaking through, and the air had that particular sharpness that comes after a long cold snap when the temperature has climbed just far enough to stop being dangerous, but not far enough to be comfortable. Eliza rode with Lillian wrapped against her chest and a second blanket draped over both of them, and Rhett rode alongside on his second horse, a gray he called Drum, for reasons he hadn't explained, with the pack tied behind his saddle. The first hour passed without conversation, not an uncomfortable silence. The working kind, where both people are paying attention to the same things, the footing, the light as it came up slowly behind the eastern ridge, the occasional sound of something moving in the trees that turned out to be wind-shifted branches, and not anything worth worrying about. It was Eliza who broke it. "How long since you've been to Ferris Bend?" she asked. 3 years? Maybe 4? "Do you know anyone there?" "A few people. The man who runs the grain trade, Hollis, used to buy from him before I started going to Cutter's Creek." A pause. "And I know Emmett Harlow, actually." She looked at him. "The judge?" "Not well. He settled a boundary dispute on my north line about 5 years back. Fair man. Slow to decide, which I mean as a compliment." She turned this over. "Did he rule in your favor?" "Partly. He split the difference, which neither side loved, which usually means he got it about right." She looked back at the trail. The light was coming up behind the ridge now in pale strips, not dramatic, just the slow daily fact of morning arriving whether or not anyone was ready for it. "He'll recognize the will," she said. "I've been over it enough times in my head. Thomas's signature is witnessed by Dr. Aldous Greer, who was his physician for 11 years. The document is dated 14 months before Thomas died. Victor's claim is based on a debt agreement that Thomas supposedly signed 8 months before his death. But I was with Thomas for most of those 8 months, and I never saw any agreement. And more importantly, Thomas had no reason to assign the land to the family trust when he had a wife and an heir on the way. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Victor's claiming the debt agreement supersedes the will? He's claiming it was a condition Thomas agreed to, that if the debts weren't resolved within a year of signing, the land reverted. He's saying Thomas died before the year was up. And you think the agreement is forged? I think it's altered, she said. I think there may have been a real debt agreement because Thomas did borrow money from the family, but I think someone changed the terms after Thomas couldn't speak for himself anymore. She paused. Victor is methodical. He wouldn't invent something from nothing. He'd take something real and adjust it just enough. Rhett considered this for a long moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them. The witnesses on the debt agreement, he said. Do you know who they are? 2 men named on the document, both from out of the territory, both conveniently hard to locate. Of course. Yes, she said. Of course. Another stretch of quiet. The trail curved south and the wind dropped as they came into a lower section where the ridgeline cut it off, and for a few minutes the air was almost still. Lillian made a small sound against Eliza's chest and subsided. He'll come to Ferris Bend, Eliza said. It wasn't a question. When he finds out I've gone there instead of Cutter's Creek, he'll come. Probably. He has money and I don't. He has men and I have... She glanced sideways at Rhett, then back at the trail. One rancher with a temper, Rhett said. She almost smiled. I was going to say one witness. I'm that too. She was quiet for a moment, then, I need you to understand something before we get there. Whatever happens in Ferris Bend, whatever Emmett Harlow decides, this is my fight, my case. I'm not asking you to fight it for me. He looked at her directly. I know. I mean it, Rhett. I've had enough of men deciding what's best for me and acting on it without asking. Even men who mean well. Thomas, she didn't say. She didn't have to. I understand, he said. And the way he said it, flat and without any performance of understanding, made her believe him. They rode on. Ferris Bend appeared in the late afternoon of the second day. After a night spent in the shelter of an abandoned line cabin they'd found 8 miles north of town, where Rhett had built a fire, and they'd eaten cold biscuits and dried meat and taken turns sleeping in 2-hour stretches while the other kept the fire fed and listened to the dark. The town was small, but not primitive. A main street with 12 buildings on each side, a church with a bell tower at the north end, a land office, a dry goods store, a saloon that was also the hotel, and a low building near the south end with a painted sign that read, Harlow, Justice of the Peace. There was a livery stable, smoke coming from 3 chimneys, and 6 or 7 people visible on the street who turned to look when the 2 horses came in from the north trail. Eliza kept her eyes forward. She had been in towns where she was known and towns where she was not, and she had learned that the ones where you are not known were both easier and harder. Easier because no one had preformed opinions. Harder because you had to earn everything from the beginning and you had no credit to draw on. They put the horses at the livery. Rhett paid, which she didn't argue about because she had almost no money and arguing about it would just be theatrical. And then Eliza asked where she could find her cousin Clara. The liveryman thought about it. Clara Vane? Eliza said. She may be Clara Price now. She was going to marry a man named Price. Price? The man said. Wheat Price. Works the mill out on Sallow Creek? I don't know. Dark-haired woman, talks fast. Eliza felt something loosen in her chest. That's her. He directed them to a house on the east side of town, 2 blocks off the main street, white-painted fence, with half the pickets leaning, a garden that was buried under snow but had clearly been ambitious in its original intention. Eliza knocked. The door opened before the second knock, because Clara Price had apparently been watching from the window, and for one suspended second the 2 women just looked at each other across 3 years of silence and distance and everything that had happened in between. Then Clara said, "You look terrible," and pulled her inside. The reunion was not sentimental, or it was briefly, and then it was practical because Clara was that kind of woman. Her feelings came out first and then she moved on, and you had to keep up. She got Eliza sitting down and the baby warm and tea on the stove, and Rhett standing somewhere she could see him before she actually sat still long enough to ask any questions. Her husband Wheat was not home. He worked the mill until dark, and she had a daughter of her own, 3 years old, named Bess, who approached Lillian with the focused intensity that small children bring to anything smaller than themselves. "Don't touch her head," Clara told Bess. "Just look." Bess looked. Clara sat across from Eliza and listened to the story without interrupting, which was unusual for her. The original Clara, the one Eliza had grown up beside, had never let anyone finish a sentence uncontested. This Clara was different, quieter in some places, more serious in the eyes. 3 years does something to a person, Eliza thought, to everyone. When she finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "Victor Crane," she said. "You've heard of him?" "I've heard the Crane name. Wheat does business with men who've done business with that family. He says they're—" She paused, choosing her words. "He says they conduct themselves as if the law is a tool that belongs to them specifically." "That's accurate," Eliza said. Clara looked at Rhett. "And you are?" "Rhett Hawthorne. I found Eliza on my trail 2 weeks ago." "Found her?" "In a storm." "Yes." Clara looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite gratitude, but contained elements of both. "You've been at his ranch for 2 weeks," she said to Eliza. "Yes." "Alone?" "With my daughter." "That's not the same as not alone." Clara paused. "I'm not criticizing, I'm calibrating. There's a difference." Rhett made a quiet sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed before it finished. Clara caught it. "Something funny?" "No," he said. "You just remind me of someone." "Who?" "A version of Eliza I haven't met yet," he said. Clara looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at her tea. "He'll do," Clara said finally, and moved on. They went to see Judge Harlow the following morning. He was younger than Eliza had expected, 40, maybe, with the particular kind of face that looks like it has absorbed a lot of difficult information without quite resolving it into an expression. He had a beard going gray at the jaw, and glasses he kept taking off and putting back on as he read. And he read Thomas's will 3 times before he set it down. "This is a properly executed document," he said. "Witnessed, dated, signed. I have no reason to question its authenticity on its face." "Victor Crane will tell you there's a debt agreement that supersedes it," Eliza said. "Then I'll need to see the debt agreement." "He has it. I don't." Harlow looked at her over his glasses. "Then we need to establish the will first, before Crane arrives with his counterclaim. If your will is on record with this court before his claim is filed, then the burden shifts to him to prove the supersession rather than to you to prove the will." He paused. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," she said. "If I file first, he's the one contesting. If he files first, I'm the one defending." "Correct." "Then let's file." Harlow looked at Rhett. "And you are here as a witness to her character and her account of events," Rhett said. "Nothing more." Harlow turned back to Eliza. "I'll need a sworn affidavit from you. I'll need the original will filed with the court, and I'll need—" He paused. "You mentioned a physician, Dr. Greer?" "He was the attending physician when the will was signed. He can testify to Thomas's mental competency at the time of signing. Can you reach him?" "I sent a letter from Cutter's Creek when I was passing through 2 weeks ago. I don't know if he's received it." Harlow nodded slowly. "I'll draft a formal request for his testimony to be sent by the county courier. In the meantime, we proceed with what we have." He stood. "You'll need to come back this afternoon to sign the affidavit. I'll have it prepared by 2 o'clock. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, not with pity, exactly, but with the particular attention a man pays when he's deciding whether to say something. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "Victor Crane is not unknown to this court. I have no authority to tell you what to expect, but I will tell you that his family has attempted similar filings in 2 other cases in this territory. In one of those cases, the defendant did not have the original will." He paused. "You have it. That matters." She stood. "I know," she said. She walked out into the cold air of the main street and stood for a moment with Lillian against her chest and the will in the satchel over her shoulder, and she let herself feel, briefly, the specific relief of having done the right thing in the right order for once, the relief of being ahead of something instead of behind it. Then Rhett appeared beside her. "He said 2 o'clock," she said. I heard. We have time to eat something. Yes. They walked toward the saloon hotel, and the town moved around them, and Eliza told herself that the hardest part was done. She was wrong. Victor Crane arrived on the fourth day. She knew before she saw him. Clara's husband Wheat came in from the mill at midday with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral and not managing it, and he said there was a man at the hotel asking about a woman who had come to town with an infant, and the man had 3 others with him, and the man had gone to see Judge Harlow that morning with a document in his hand. Eliza was at the kitchen table feeding Lillian. She finished feeding her daughter. She set Lillian down in Clara's arms. She stood up. "Where's Rhett?" she asked. "Livery," Wheat said. "He was checking on the horses an hour ago." She put on her coat. "Eliza," Clara said. "I'm going to the judge's office," Eliza said. "Victor filed something this morning, which means Harlow has both documents now. I need to be there." "You should wait for Rhett." "I'm not waiting for Rhett." She said it without heat, without drama, just the flat fact of it. "I'll send someone to the livery." She walked out. The main street of Ferris Bend was not crowded, but it felt different than it had 4 days ago. The handful of people she had seen before, the ones who'd watched her ride in, were now watching from different angles, and their watching had a different quality. The kind that happens when a town has received information it's still processing. She saw Victor before he saw her. He was standing outside the judge's office, talking to one of his men. He was taller than she remembered, or it seemed that way, which might have been the open space, or might have been 2 weeks of her carefully not thinking about him. I was dressed well. He always dressed well, which was partly a statement about money and partly a statement about the kind of man who understood that appearance was its own argument. His coat was good wool. His hat was not a working hat. He saw her. His expression did not change quickly. That was always the thing about Victor. He didn't react immediately because he didn't need to. He had time. He always believed he had time. "Eliza," he said. "Victor." He looked at the space beside her, checking for Rhett, she realized. She had come without him. A small shift in Victor's expression, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "You filed the will," he said, 4 days ago. "Then you already know I've filed the agreement." "I assumed you would." He stepped closer. Not threateningly. Victor never did anything that could be described as threatening by someone who hadn't lived with him for 2 years. He was too careful for that. He moved the way powerful men move when they want you to remember who has more resources without actually saying so. "This doesn't have to go to a full hearing," he said. "I have no interest in making this difficult for you. You can walk away, keep what you can carry. I won't pursue any claim on your personal belongings, and Lillian stays in the family. She'll be raised properly, educated. She won't want for anything." The sheer completeness of his confidence was still breathtaking, even now, even after everything. "She's not yours," Eliza said. "She never was." "She's a Vane," he said. "Thomas's daughter." Thomas was a Vane. The Vane family consists of Thomas, Eliza said, who is dead, and you, who are not a Vane by blood, only by marriage, and whose wife, Thomas's sister, died 3 years ago, which means your claim to the Vane family name is even more attenuated than you seem to want to admit in public. Victor's expression shifted. She had never talked to him like that. Not in 2 years of watching him circle Thomas like something patient and careful waiting for an opening. She had held her tongue and managed her face and learned to exist in the same room as him without giving him anything to use. She had run out of interest in doing that. "The debt agreement supersedes the will," he said. The judge will examine both documents," she said, "which is exactly what I want. Because when he examines both, he will notice that the debt agreement has 2 witnesses from out of territory who cannot be located, and that it was prepared by an attorney in Billings whose office cannot confirm they acted for Thomas, and that the agreement was never mentioned to me, to Thomas's physician, or to the one friend Thomas trusted enough to tell about the debts in the first place." A pause. "You've been busy," Victor said. "I've had 2 weeks." He looked at her. Something moving in his eyes. She could read it now better than she ever had, and what she read was not quite rage and not quite respect. Something uncomfortable that lived between them. "You found someone to help you," he said. "The rancher." "I found shelter in a storm," she said. "Everything after that I did myself." She was not entirely sure that was true. But she needed it to be true right now, and Rhett was not here to complicate it. "The judge will rule on these documents," she said again. "I'm not interested in a negotiation, Victor. There's nothing to negotiate. Thomas left me the land and the house and the right to raise our daughter. You have a piece of paper I believe was altered after Thomas died. We'll let Harlow decide which of those things is more credible." She walked past him. She felt his eyes on her back and she did not turn around. Her hands were shaking. They had started shaking about 40 seconds into the conversation, and they hadn't stopped. She got to the corner before she allowed herself to stop walking, and she pressed her back against the wall of the dry goods store and breathed once deeply and waited for her hands to come back under control. They took a moment. Then she straightened up and turned the corner. Rhett was coming up the street from the livery direction. He saw her face and stopped. "Victor's here," she said. "I know. Wheat came to tell me." He looked at her hands, which were still not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She paused. "I spoke with him. I can see that." "Alone," she added. "I know you wanted to be there." "I didn't say that." She looked at him. "I didn't say that," he repeated, quieter. "What did he say?" She told him, all of it, the offer, the agreement, the way he'd moved, the precursor to a smile. Rhett listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on, his ability to receive information without layering his own reaction over it before you were done. When she finished, he said, "You named the attorney in Billings." "I bluffed about part of it," she said. "I don't have confirmation from the attorney's office. I just said it to see how he'd react." "How did he react?" "He didn't deny it." Rhett looked at the main street for a moment, at the corner where Victor had been standing, now empty. "That's the kind of non-denial that means something," he said. "I know. We need to tell Harlow." "I know that too." He looked back at her. "You went out there alone on purpose. You didn't want me standing beside you when you faced him." It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way he said most things, like he was simply naming what he'd observed. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said. She blinked. "I'm serious," he said. "If you'd walked out there with me at your shoulder, he would have spent the whole conversation looking at me. He would have been calculating me. You would have been the footnote." He paused. "You needed him to look at you." She had thought this herself 2 blocks ago, while her hands were still shaking. Hearing it from him, hearing it said plainly, without any performance of having it be a compliment, did something to her she didn't immediately have words for. "He's going to fight it," she said. "He's not going to fold because I pushed back." "No, he's not." The hearing could go badly if Harlow gives more weight to the agreement than to the will, if he decides that the witnesses, however suspicious, constitute a legally sufficient basis. "Then we appeal," Rhett said. She stared at him. "We appeal," he said again, steadily, "to the county court in Cutter's Creek, with more time to get the Billings attorney's response in writing, and more time to find one of those out-of-territory witnesses if they can be found. You don't lose everything in one hearing, Eliza. You just find out where you fight next." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not going back to the ranch," she said slowly. "You're staying for the hearing. I said I'd take you to Ferris Bend. I didn't say I'd leave before the reason for coming was resolved. Rhett, I've got 4 days of work backed up on the ranch regardless. 4 or 8 makes the same kind of mess. I might as well stay." She recognized what he was doing, wrapping the real thing in practical language so she wouldn't feel like she owed him something she couldn't afford to owe. She recognized it because she'd been doing the same thing to herself for 2 weeks. "Thank you," she said. "Let's go see Harlow," he said, and walked ahead, and she followed, and the two of them went up the main street of Ferris Bend while Victor Crane watched from somewhere she couldn't see and somewhere she had decided not to look for. The hearing was set for 3 days out. In those 3 days, Ferris Bend arranged itself around the conflict the way small towns do, quietly, without anyone announcing it, but visibly. People had opinions. Some of them expressed the opinions to Clara, who expressed them to Eliza, who processed them, and didn't let them change anything. The opinion that surprised her most came from an older woman named Dottie Marsh, who ran the dry goods store, and who had lived in Ferris Bend for 30 years and was known, Clara said, for being unwilling to comment on things that weren't her business. She stopped Eliza on the street the second day and looked at her for a moment with dark, sharp eyes. You're the Vane widow, she said. Yes. I've seen the crane type before. Different name, same shape. She paused. You file everything, every piece of paper you have. You don't let anything stay in your coat pocket when it could be on the judge's desk. I've done that, Eliza said. Good. The woman looked at her for one more second. You look like you can carry it. She walked away before Eliza could respond. Clara, standing beside Eliza, said, That's as close to a declaration of support as Dottie Marsh has given anyone in this decade. Eliza watched the woman's back. Then I'll take it, she said. The night before the hearing, Eliza could not sleep. She lay in the small room at the back of Clara's house with Lillian asleep beside her, and looked at the ceiling and ran through the case the way she'd been running through it for days. The will, the witnesses, the debt agreement, Victor's story against hers, the attorney in Billings who had not yet responded to her letter. Dr. Greer, who had received the formal request from Harlow's office and whose response had arrived that morning, a sworn statement, written in the precise and unsentimental language of a man who understood he was being asked to do something important, confirming that Thomas Vane was of sound mind and clear intention when he signed his will, that no one else had been present except the two witnesses, and that Dr. Greer had himself retained a copy of the document at Thomas's request. That last detail. That was the thing. Dr. Greer had a copy. Victor had not known that. She had not known it either until this morning. She lay in the dark and thought about Thomas. Not the Thomas of the last 8 months, the one who was tired and worried and keeping things from her, but the earlier Thomas, the one who had showed up on her father's doorstep in Nebraska 11 years ago and told her, with no particular confidence, that he intended to build something in Montana that would be worth having. He had kept things from her. That was true. He had been proud, and he had been scared, and he had made decisions without her that he should have made with her, and she had spent 2 months angry at a dead man for it, which was its own particular kind of grief. But he had left her the land, and he had kept a copy of the will with his physician. And the signature on that document was his, unmistakably his, the same looping H in Hawthorne. No, she corrected herself, in vain. That was Thomas's hand. She knew it as well as her own. She had loved him. She was still learning what to do with that past tense. Lillian moved in her sleep, small fist against her cheek, the way she always slept. Eliza thought about Victor standing on the street, that not-quite smile, that absolute certainty that she would fold. She thought about him deciding, somewhere in the weeks after Thomas died, that the most efficient path to the land was through the woman holding the will, and that the most efficient path through the woman was fear. He had been almost right. The almost was standing in the livery stable 300 yards away, sleeping in a hay pile that was definitely not comfortable, because he had given his room at the hotel to Eliza, and Clara had no more space. She had told him he didn't have to do that. He had said he'd slept in worse, which she believed, and gone without further discussion. She closed her eyes. She thought, tomorrow, Emmett Harlow will read both documents in front of both parties and whatever witnesses appear, and he will ask his questions in his slow way, and Victor will have his answers prepared, and she will have hers, and Dr. Greer's statement will be on the desk, and the copy of the will that the physician had kept for 11 years will be beside it. She thought, I have done everything I can do. She thought, it has to be enough. She did not sleep for a long time, but somewhere in the early hours, with Lillian's small warm weight beside her, and the wind off the Montana plain moving against the window, she reached the particular exhaustion that is past worry, the place on the other side of it where your body simply makes the decision for you, and she slept. She dreamed of the trail, the frozen trail, the pine trees, the snow, and the sound of a horse stopping. Victor Crane arrived at the judge's office 20 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, with 2 of his men flanking him and a lawyer, a real one, brought from Billings, which cost money she didn't want to think about, at his side. Eliza arrived with Rhett and Clara, who had insisted on coming and had left Bess with Wheat, and her expression was not one that invited debate. The room was small, a desk, chairs, a window that looked out on the side street, a stove that was working too hard. Judge Harlow was already at his desk when they came in, both documents laid out in front of him with the physician's statement to one side. He let everyone find a position before he spoke. We're here to establish the legal disposition of the Vane property in Gristle Flats, he said. I have before me a last will and testament dated 14 months prior to Thomas Vane's death, and a debt agreement dated 8 months prior to his death. Both are signed documents. Both purport to determine what happens to the property. My job today is to ditch document controls. He looked up. We'll start with the will. He turned to Eliza. She sat forward. She had been afraid this morning when she woke up. She was still afraid, in the way that doesn't go away because you talk yourself out of it, but rather shrinks to a manageable size when you decide to move toward the thing instead of away from it. She sat forward and she looked at the judge and she told him, clearly and without trembling, exactly what she knew. Across the room, Victor watched her. His expression, for the first time since she'd known him, was something she couldn't fully read. That was new. She kept her eyes on Harlow and kept talking. Harlow listened the way Eliza had expected him to, steadily, without expression, taking notes in a hand that moved slowly but didn't stop. He let her speak without interruption, and when she finished, he asked 3 questions. The date she had last seen the original will in Thomas's possession, the name of the second witness on the document besides Dr. Greer, and whether she had any correspondence from Thomas that referenced the debt to Victor's family. She answered all 3. The second witness was a woman named Ruth Alderman, Thomas's schoolteacher from childhood, who had remained his correspondent for years and who lived in a town called Hales Ferry, 60 miles east. Eliza had not thought to contact her before now. Ruth Alderman had been a name on a document, not a person she'd thought to reach for, but she said the name clearly and watched Harlow write it down. Then Victor's lawyer stood up. His name was Cresswell, and he was the kind of man who had learned to make a courtroom, even a makeshift one in a justice of the peace's office in a small Montana town, feel like his natural territory. He was not aggressive. He was patient, which was harder to counter than aggression. He asked his questions about the will in a tone that suggested he found them mildly interesting rather than crucial, and the mildness was itself a strategy, because it made Eliza feel she was defending against something she couldn't quite locate. He asked whether Thomas had discussed the family debts with her at any point during the 8 months before his death. He told me there were debts, she said. He didn't tell me the full amount. So there are aspects of the financial arrangement between your late husband and the Crane family that you were not privy to. There are aspects of the financial arrangement that Thomas kept from me, she said. That's not the same as the arrangement being valid. Cresswell smiled faintly. Of course not. But you'd agree that a wife's incomplete knowledge of her husband's business dealings doesn't make those dealings non-existent. I'd agree that a document signed without witnesses who can be confirmed, prepared by an attorney whose office has not responded to confirm their involvement, and never disclosed to the wife, the physician, or any known associate of the deceased during his lifetime, deserves scrutiny regardless of what I knew. Harlow looked up from his notes. Cresswell adjusted his approach. He moved to the debt agreement itself, its language, its terms, the reversion clause that Victor was basing his entire claim on. He walked through it with the patience of a man who had read it many times. And he was good at it, she would give him that. By the time he was done laying out the agreement's provisions, it sounded almost reasonable. It sounded like the kind of arrangement a man in debt might make. It sounded like Thomas. And that was the difficult part, because it did sound like Thomas. Not the specific language. Some of that was too formal, too clean for a man who wrote in quick, slightly impatient sentences. But the underlying structure of it, the idea of borrowing against the land as collateral, of agreeing to terms that were more generous to the lender than they needed to be because Thomas had been constitutionally incapable of negotiating hard with people he felt he owed. That part sounded exactly like Thomas. Eliza sat with that discomfort and did not let it show. When Cresswell finished, Harlow looked at the document again. The reversion clause, he said. It specifies that if the debt is not satisfied within 12 months of signing, the property reverts to the Crane family trust. He looked at Victor. What was the amount of the debt? Victor answered. The number was large, larger than Eliza had known, though in the range she'd feared. And the debt was not satisfied within 12 months. Thomas died 9 months into the agreement, Victor said. The debt died with him, but the land obligation survived. That is what the agreement specifies. Harlow was quiet for a moment. He looked at Dr. Greer's statement. He looked at the will. He looked at the debt agreement. I'm going to need a recess, he said. I want to review both documents against the physician's statement, and I want to send a courier to Hales Ferry today to attempt contact with Ruth Alderman. He looked at both parties. We reconvene tomorrow morning, Neither party is to leave Ferris Bend. He stood. Hearing was over for the day. The afternoon was the longest Eliza could remember. She went back to Clara's house and sat at the kitchen table and tried to eat something and mostly moved food around the plate. And Clara sat across from her and didn't try to make it better, which was exactly the right thing to do. Rhett was not there. He had gone somewhere after the hearing. She didn't know where and hadn't asked. She trusted him to come back. That trust surprised her a little, even now, how quickly it had established itself, and how deep it went for a woman who had decided 2 months ago that trust was a resource she was going to ration very carefully going forward. He came back in the early evening. He sat down at the table without announcement, and Clara got him a plate without being asked, and he ate half of it before he said anything. "The attorney in Billings," he said. Eliza looked up. "I found the telegraph office. I sent a message this afternoon to the county courthouse in Billings, not to the attorney, to the court. Asked them to check their filings for any documentation of a debt agreement between Thomas Vane and Victor Crane, or any record of the attorney named on the agreement acting in that capacity for Vane." He paused. "They may not respond before tomorrow morning, but they may." She stared at him. How did you know to go to the courthouse instead of the attorney?" If the agreement was legitimately drawn up, the attorney would have filed a copy with the court as part of standard practice. If he didn't file it, he left the rest unspoken. "If he didn't file it, there's no record of his involvement," she said. "Right." Clara was looking at Rhett with an expression Eliza recognized as reevaluation, the recalculation of someone who had already assessed a person and was now adjusting the result upward. "You've done legal work before," Clara said. "I've been involved in land disputes before," Rhett said. "Different situation, same general shape." He didn't elaborate, and neither of them pushed. "If the courthouse responds in time," Eliza said slowly. "It's a long shot," he said. "I'm not telling you to count on it. I'm telling you I sent it." She looked at him across the table. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly, the way he did when he was declining thanks he didn't feel he'd earned. She had come to recognize this gesture. The small refusal of credit that wasn't false modesty, but something more specific, a genuine discomfort with being thanked for things he considered obvious. "I need you to understand something," she said, "about tomorrow." "All right. If Harlow rules against me, the agreement holds. I'm going to appeal. I told you that, and I meant it. But I want you to know that whatever happens in that room tomorrow, I'm not going to come apart in front of Victor Crane." "I know you're not." "I might come apart afterward," she said. "Later, when there's no one from the other side watching, but not in front of him." Rhett looked at her steadily. "I know that too. I just needed to say it." "All right." Clara looked between them with the expression of someone watching a conversation that was doing more work than its words. She picked up her plate and took it to the sink and made more noise than necessary washing it, which was her version of privacy. The telegraph response arrived at 8:30 the following morning. Rhett had gone to the office at 7 when it opened, and he was back at Clara's house by 8:45 with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression that was not a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. Eliza was feeding Lillian. She looked up. "No filing," he said. She stopped moving. "The Billings courthouse has no record of the attorney named on the debt agreement acting for Thomas Vane. They have no record of the agreement being filed. They have no record of that attorney handling any matter involving the Crane family trust." She set Lillian down in Clara's arms. She took the paper from Rhett and read it. It was brief. The county court clerk's language was dry and official, the language of someone who was simply reporting what was and was not in the files, with no opinion about what that meant. But what it reported was clear. The attorney on the debt agreement had no record of the agreement. She read it twice. "This doesn't prove Victor forged it," she said. "He could argue the attorney failed to file, or that it was handled outside the usual process." "It's not proof," Rhett said, "but it's a question Harlow is going to have to answer, and every question that doesn't have a clean answer works in your favor." She handed the paper back. "We need to give this to Harlow before we go in," she said. "That was my thought." She put on her coat. The second day of the hearing had a different texture than the first. Harlow had clearly spent the night with both documents, because when he came in that morning, he had made marks in the margins of his notes that hadn't been there the day before, and he set them down on the desk with the particular careful placement of a man who has reached some preliminary conclusions and wants to make sure his materials don't get shuffled. Before he opened proceedings, Rhett handed him the telegraph response. Harlow read it. He set it to the side. He looked at Cresswell, and something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not judgment, not accusation, but the adjustment of a man who is now asking different questions than he was 24 hours ago. Before we proceed, Harlow said, I have some questions about the debt agreement specifically. Mr. Cresswell, your client has represented this document as a legally binding contract. Can you confirm whether a copy was filed with any court or legal office at the time of its execution? Cresswell was smooth. Country arrangements of this nature are sometimes conducted outside the formal filing process. That's not what I asked. A pause. To my knowledge, Cresswell said carefully, no copy was filed. Was the attorney named on the document engaged by Thomas Vane directly or through another party? I would need to confirm those details. The courthouse in Billings has no record of this attorney acting for Mr. Vane, Harlow said. He did not hold up the telegraph paper. He simply stated it as fact, the way a man does when the fact is sufficient on its own. I've also received this morning a letter from Hales Ferry. Ruth Alderman, the second witness named on Thomas Vane's will, has confirmed her signature and her presence at the signing. She has further confirmed that Thomas Vane spoke to her about the will on a subsequent occasion, approximately 6 months before his death, and expressed his intention that his wife inherit the property unconditionally. The room was quiet. Victor, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the particular neutrality of a man waiting for the right moment, shifted in his chair. It was a small movement. Eliza caught it. His lawyer had not had time to prepare for Ruth Alderman. The letter had come in this morning. That was the thing about Victor's plan. It had been built on the assumption that Eliza would not have time to prepare, that she would be too exhausted and too frightened and too isolated to locate her witnesses or know to look for the right records. He had timed it for her weakness. He had not counted on a 14-day snowstorm and an empty ranch with a working stove. Harlow turned to Eliza. Mrs. Vane, you've testified that your husband kept certain financial matters from you. You've also testified that the debt agreement was never disclosed to you, to Dr. Greer, or to Ruth Alderman, despite subsequent conversations your husband had with both. He paused. I want to give you the opportunity to address the substance of the debt itself, not the agreement, the debt. Do you believe Thomas Vane owed money to Victor Crane's family? She had thought about this question. She had known it was coming. Yes, she said. I believe he did. Thomas borrowed money from the Crane family on at least 2 occasions that I know of. I believe the debt was real. I believe the debt was significant. She paused. What I don't believe is that Thomas would have signed an agreement assigning my land and my child to Victor Crane as collateral for a debt that he believed he could satisfy. He was proud and he was protective. He would have found another way. She paused again. And I believe that if he had signed such an agreement, if he had made that choice with full knowledge of what it meant, he would have told me. He kept things from me to protect me, not to betray me. Her voice was steady. She had not known it would be until she heard it. Thomas was not a perfect man, but he loved his daughter before she was born. He would not have put her at risk. Harlow wrote something. Cresswell tried once more. He suggested that Eliza's belief in her husband's character, while understandable, was not evidence of the agreement's invalidity. He suggested that grieving widows were sometimes unaware of the full complexity of their husband's business dealings. He was careful, and he was professional, and he did not say anything that could be called cruel, but the weight of what he was suggesting pressed down on her anyway. She sat with it. She breathed. She did not answer until Harlow gave her the opportunity, and when she did, she said simply, "The burden of proof for a document superseding a properly witnessed, properly executed will is on the party presenting that document. The attorney cannot confirm his involvement. The witnesses cannot be located. No copy was filed. I am not required to prove the agreement is fraudulent. I am only required to show that it has not been sufficiently established as valid, and it has not." Harlow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the documents. It was quiet for long enough that the fire in the stove had time to settle and shift before he spoke again. "I'm going to reserve formal judgment for 48 hours, he said. "I want the record to reflect that I find the debt agreement to be insufficiently substantiated as presented. The absence of any filing record, the inability to confirm the attorney's involvement, and the lack of any testimony from either named witness constitutes significant deficiencies in the document's credibility. He looked at Victor directly. This does not constitute a finding of fraud. It constitutes a finding that the document, as presented, does not meet the evidentiary standard required to supersede a properly executed will. He returned to his notes. Within 48 hours, I will issue a formal ruling on the disposition of the Vane property. Both parties will be notified. He stood. The hearing was over. What happened next did not happen in the hearing room. It happened on the steps outside, in the cold, in the 2 minutes before everyone found their separate directions. Victor came to her. Not his lawyer. Not his men. Him. Rhett moved. She felt it, a shift in the air to her left, and she put her hand out without looking, not touching him, just a signal. He stopped. Victor stopped 3 feet from her. He was not angry. That was the strangest thing. He looked the way a man looks when he has been playing a long game and has reached the move where the board no longer goes the way he planned, and he is already calculating what comes after. Not conceding, recalculating. This isn't finished, he said. I know, she said. I'll appeal whatever Harlow decides. I'll take it to the county court. Victor, she said. He stopped. I know you'll appeal, she said. I know you'll take it to every court available to you, and I know you have more money for lawyers than I have for food. I know that. She looked at him steadily. But I want you to hear me say this once, clearly, so there's no confusion about where I stand. You will not get my daughter. You will not get my land. Not because I have more resources than you, and not because I'm going to win every hearing cleanly, but because I'm not going to stop. I don't have a backup plan. I don't have somewhere else to go. This is the only fight I have, and I'm going to fight it for as long as it takes. Victor looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a slow alteration, like watching a building you thought was finished reveal another floor. Thomas underestimated you, he said. She had not expected that, not from him. Yes, she said, he did. Victor looked at Rhett briefly. And this man? This man, she said, has not made that mistake. A pause. Victor turned and walked away, his lawyer falling in beside him without a word, his 2 men following at the same distance they'd maintained all week. She watched him go. Rhett said nothing for a moment, then, "You put your hand out." "I didn't want you to move." "I know, I'm just noting it." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the direction Victor had gone, his expression the careful neutral it got when he was thinking about something he hadn't worked out yet. "I can handle him," she said. "I know you can." He looked at her. "I wasn't worried about him. I was worried about what I'd do if he said something that required a response." She understood what he meant. Not that he was violent, she had not seen that in him, not exactly, but that he was the kind of man who did not watch injustice happen from a comfortable distance, and that watching Victor work his particular brand of quiet pressure on Eliza had been costing him something. "Thank you for staying back," she said. "Thank you for letting me know to." They stood there for a moment longer in the cold air of the street. 48 hours, she said. "Yes. I don't want to spend them thinking about the ruling." "What do you want to spend them doing?" She considered. "Clara has a list of things that need fixing around her house, longer than yours was." Something crossed his face, that not quite laugh, the ghost of ease. "Is fixing other people's houses going to become a habit?" "I find it helps," she said, "having something to do with my hands." "All right," he said. "Let's go fix Clara's house." They spent the rest of that day and most of the next doing exactly that. It was Wheat who identified the problems: the sagging section of fence along the back of the property, the window frame in the bedroom that had warped in the summer and now let in cold air at the sill, the door on the root cellar that had dropped on its hinges and required 2 people to open. Rhett and Wheat worked on the fence together in the afternoon, and Eliza worked on the window frame herself with a plane she found in Wheat's toolbox, and the physical work of it, the small, precise labor of improving a thing that was broken, did what it always did for her, which was quiet the part of her mind that ran in circles. Clara watched Eliza work and said, "You're better at that than Wheat is." "I grew up fixing things," Eliza said. She ran the plane along the edge of the frame. "My father had a farm and not enough money to hire anyone. You learn or you don't." "Thomas didn't know that about you?" Eliza paused. He knew I'd grown up on a farm, she said. He didn't. He had a particular picture of what a wife was supposed to do, and I fit myself into it more than I should have. She shaved another thin curl of wood from the frame edge. It was easier at the time. It seemed like a small thing to give up. And now? She tested the frame. Better. Now I think the small things you give up have a way of compounding, she said. You give up one, and the next one is a little easier to give up. And after a few years, you've given up so many small things that you can't find yourself in the picture anymore. Clara was quiet for a moment. Rhett doesn't seem to want you to give anything up, she said. Eliza looked up at the window. No, she said. He doesn't. That's unusual. I know. I'm not saying you should do anything about it, Clara said. I'm just noting it, the way you noted it back to me when I told you Wheat always leaves the door open when he comes in from the cold instead of closing it behind him, and I said, I don't mind it, and you said you'd noticed. Eliza laughed. It came out before she could organize it, a real laugh, short and genuine. That was not the same thing, she said. Wasn't it? She went back to the window frame and didn't answer, and Clara let her not answer, which was one of the things about Clara that had always been valuable. The ruling came on a Tuesday morning. Harlow had written it out in full, which Eliza had not expected. She had expected a verbal ruling with documentation to follow. Instead, he handed each party a written copy, 4 pages in his careful, somewhat cramped hand, and gave them time to read before he said anything. She read it standing up. She read the first page and the conclusion of the 4th page, and then went back and read the whole thing in order. The will controlled. The debt agreement was found insufficient to supersede it, for the reasons he had outlined at the close of the hearing: the lack of filing record, the inability to confirm the attorney's involvement, the absence of witnesses who could be located, and the testimony of Ruth Alderman, who had confirmed Thomas's stated intent after the agreement's supposed signing date. He found no formal fraud. He was careful about that. He stated clearly that the insufficiency of the evidence did not constitute proof that the agreement had been falsified, only that it had not been sufficiently proven to override a valid will. Victor retained the right to appeal. His claim was not extinguished, only denied at this level. But the property was Eliza's. Lillian was Eliza's. She read it one more time to be sure she had understood it correctly. She had. She folded the pages carefully and put them in her satchel alongside the original will, and she looked up, and the first thing she saw was Victor across the room, reading his copy. His face gave nothing away. His lawyer said something to him in a low voice. Victor shook his head slightly, a small movement, more refusal than response. He looked up and found her eyes. She held his gaze. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at him on the street, with the same steadiness that had started somewhere in a storm on a frozen trail and had not left her since. He looked away first. She turned to Rhett. He was watching her. Had been watching her, she thought, since she started reading. He looked at her face, and whatever he read there told him what the ruling was, and he exhaled once, quietly, and that was it. No performance from him either, just the breath, and then the steadiness returning. All right, he said. Yes, she said. She picked up her satchel. She walked out of Harlow's office into the cold morning air of Ferris Bend, and she stood on the step for a moment, and it was not how she'd imagined it would feel. Not triumphant. Not relieved exactly. Something quieter than either of those things. More like the specific feeling of being allowed to stay in your own life. She had not known until this moment how much of the last 2 months had felt like being evicted from herself. From the woman she had been before Victor showed up with his papers and his hired men and his absolute confidence in her collapse. She had been running since that morning. She had been surviving. She had done it well, considering, but surviving is different from standing, and standing is different from being somewhere you're allowed to be. She was allowed to be here. Rhett came out behind her. He stood beside her on the step and looked at the street. Victor will appeal, she said. Probably. It'll take months, maybe longer. Most likely. She looked at the sky. It was pale blue, the same color it had been the morning they'd left his ranch, the color it turns when the worst of the cold has broken. I need to go back to Gristle Flats, she said. I need to be on my land, in my house, with the official ruling in my hand and the deed filed locally before Victor can file an appeal claim locally. That makes sense, Rhett said. She turned to look at him. Gristle Flats is 40 miles north, she said. Your ranch is 30 miles east of Gristle Flats. If you take me back, I'll take you back. It's a long way out of your path. He turned to look at her. You've said this before, he said. The thing where you point out that I don't have to do something. And you don't. I know. He held her gaze. I've known that every time. I still did it. She looked at him for a moment. Why? She asked. It was the first time she had asked it directly, without cushioning it in practical language, without leaving room for him to turn it into logistics. He was quiet for a moment. Because you were worth showing up for, he said. Because you are. He looked back at the street. Because some things you do because they're right, and some things you do because you'd be a smaller version of yourself if you didn't, and I've already spent 4 years getting smaller. I'm not interested in continuing. She stood beside him in the cold morning air and thought about the closed room in his ranch house, and the photograph in the book, and the way he had held Lillian against his chest in the dark and walked her back to sleep with the particular care of a man who has learned what it costs to lose something. She thought about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up every day in the practical form of a man who gets down from his horse in a snowstorm and leads it through the trees at a pace that gives a stranger enough time to decide to trust him. Let's go tell Clara, she said. He nodded. They stepped off the porch together into the morning, and behind them Harlow's office door swung shut with the quiet click of something decided, and the street of Ferris Bend lay ahead of them, ordinary and cold and fully real, and Eliza walked into it without looking back at the door, because the thing she was going toward had become, somewhere in the last 30 days, more significant than anything she was leaving behind. The road back to Gristle Flats took 2 days. Not because the trail was bad, it had held the way Rhett had said it would, but because Lillian developed a mild fever on the first afternoon, the kind that makes a new mother's chest tighten and her hands go cold, even when every sign says it will pass on its own. They stopped early, found another abandoned line cabin 3 miles off the main trail, and Rhett built the fire up while Eliza held her daughter and watched her breathe and did the particular math of helplessness that parents do when something small and irreplaceable is struggling. By morning, the fever had broken. Lillian ate well and looked at the ceiling of the line cabin with her usual cataloging attention, and Eliza sat on the floor with her back against the wall and exhaled so hard it was almost a sound. Rhett handed her coffee without being asked. She took it. She's fine, he said. I know. You've been watching her for 3 hours. I know that too. He sat down on the floor beside her, not close, but near, the way he'd learned to be near without making it mean anything she hadn't agreed to yet. She had noticed this about him from the beginning, this specific quality of presence that did not demand acknowledgement. Most men she had known required some form of recognition for the space they occupied. Rhett simply occupied it and left the interpretation to her. I was thinking, she said, about what Victor said, that Thomas underestimated me. What about it? I've been turning it over. Because he's right, in a way. Thomas did underestimate me, or he made the same mistake a lot of men make with women they love, which is deciding that protecting someone and trusting them are the same thing. He kept the debt from me because he didn't want me to worry. He kept the will from me, the existence of it, the copy with Dr. Greer, because he thought if he managed everything quietly, I would be spared. She looked at the fire. He was trying to carry it all himself, and when he died, he dropped it, and I was standing there without any of the information I needed to pick it up. Rhett was quiet. The strange thing, she said, is that I'm not angry at him anymore. I was, for a while. Those first weeks, running, carrying Lillian, trying to piece together what had happened to our land and our money and our future, I was furious at him. At a dead man, which is its own kind of grief, being furious at someone who can't explain themselves. She paused. But I think I understand now what he was doing, even if it was wrong. He loved me in the only way he knew how, which was imperfectly, and with the best intentions, and without quite enough trust in what I could handle. Most people love that way, Rhett said. She looked at him. Most people, he said again, quieter, love with the best of what they have, which is never the whole thing. She understood he was not only talking about Thomas. She looked back at the fire. Margaret, she said. I kept things from her too, he said. Not financial things, other things. How scared I was about the ranch the first 2 years. How much I doubted whether I'd made the right choices. I kept those things neat and folded where she couldn't see them because I thought a husband was supposed to be certain. He was quiet for a moment. She knew anyway. She always knew. But she let me have the performance of it because she understood it was what I needed. And that's its own kind of love, I think. The kind that sees you clearly and doesn't say so. The fire settled. Lillian made a small sound and went back to sleep. We're both carrying people, Eliza said softly. Yes. Is that all right? He looked at her then, directly, the way he had looked at her on the trail in the storm, with that specific quality of attention that did not look away. I think it has to be, he said. I think the people who've loved us are part of what we are now. You can't put them down. You can only figure out how to walk with them and still have your hands free for what's in front of you. She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, That's the most you've said at once since I've known you. He turned back to the fire. Don't read too much into it. I've been awake since 4. She laughed, the same kind of laugh as before, unplanned, genuine. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved, and that was enough. They reached Gristle Flats on the afternoon of the second day. It was smaller than she remembered, or seemed that way after the weeks of movement. A collection of buildings off a central trail, a grain store, a small post office, a feed yard, and a scattering of farms and homesteads in the surrounding miles. It was not a town that looked at newcomers with any particular warmth, but it was not hostile either. It simply was. A practical settlement on the Montana plain that had no energy to spare for sentiment. People recognized her. She had expected that. She had not expected the specific quality of their recognition. Not quite pity, not quite curiosity, something closer to the cautious reevaluation of people who had watched a woman leave under pressure and were now watching her return with a ruling in her satchel and a man she hadn't left with riding beside her. She did not explain herself to anyone. She rode to her house. It was standing. She had not been entirely sure it would be. Victor had men, and men with nothing to do sometimes did damage. But it stood undisturbed, the shutters closed the way she had left them, the front step still carrying the faint impression of too many boots, which was the last thing she had noticed before she walked out. She got down from the horse. She stood in front of the door for a moment. She thought about the morning Victor had opened it without knocking, and the sound it had made against the wall, and the look on his face. The irritation of a man who finds something he expected to be gone still present. She put her hand on the door and opened it herself, and walked in. The house was cold and stale and smelled like a closed space, but it was intact. The furniture was where she had left it. Thomas's books were still on the shelf. She looked at them first before anything else, because they were the things she had thought about most on the trail, in the cold, when she was trying to find something to hold on to. 12 books. She had memorized their spines years ago. All 12. She set Lillian in the chair near the cold hearth and got the fire started before she let herself do anything else, because the house needed to come back to life in the practical sense before it could come back to life in the other sense. Rhett brought in the packs and set them by the door and looked at the room with the attention he gave to all spaces, assessing, not judging. What do you need first? He asked. Fire, she said. Already started. Water. Supplies from the packs. And then, she paused. I need to go to the land office here and file the ruling. Today, if they're still open. It's 3:30, he said. They likely close at 5. Then we go now. They went. The land office was a single room attached to the back of the post office, run by a man named Casper Diggs, who had held the position for 12 years, and who looked at Eliza's ruling with the expression of a man who had seen enough disputes to have lost his investment in their outcomes. He read the document. He checked the will against his own registry copy, which existed because Thomas had filed it before his death. One more thing he had done correctly in the end. He stamped the ruling. He recorded the date. He handed her back her copy. Any appeal filed against this property will be flagged to this office, he said. You'll have the opportunity to respond. Thank you, she said. She tucked the papers away and walked out into the cold afternoon air of Gristle Flats and thought, it is done. Or this part is done. Victor could still appeal to the county court, and probably would, and that fight would come when it came. But the property was hers on record. The ruling was filed. The land her husband had borrowed against and worried over and ultimately protected with the last legal document he ever signed was, officially, in her name. Lillian was hers. The house was hers. She stood on the step of the land office and breathed in the cold air and did not feel triumphant, because triumph requires an enemy fully defeated, and Victor Crane was not fully defeated. But she felt something solid, something load-bearing, click into place beneath her feet. She was standing on ground that was hers. Rhett stayed 3 more days. He said it was practical. The horses needed rest before the return trip, and there were things he could do on her property while he was there that would make the coming months easier. The fence line along the north edge of her land was down in 3 places. The barn door had a broken crossbar. The root cellar steps had rotted on the bottom too. He was right on all of it. And she did not argue. They worked alongside each other, the way they had learned to work in his kitchen, in his barn, on his roof, with the easy division of labor that develops between 2 people who have stopped needing to announce what they're doing because the other person can see it and adjust. She worked inside, getting the house habitable, airing the rooms, inventorying what she had and what she needed, writing a list in Thomas's old account book that she had found undisturbed in the desk drawer. On the second evening, she found herself in the doorway of the room she had prepared for Lillian before she was born, the room she had left in its finished state when she fled, because taking the time to dismantle it had been beyond her, and because some part of her, even in the worst of it, had not been willing to undo the only thing that felt ready. The room was as she had left it, small, clean. A wooden crib Thomas had built himself badly, with joints that were slightly uneven and one side rail that required a wedge to sit level, because he had been an excellent farmer and a deeply mediocre carpenter. A quilt on the crib mattress that she had sewn from scraps. A window that faced east. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Rhett appeared behind her. She had heard him come in from outside, and she had heard him stop when he saw her in the doorway, and she had not turned around. He built it himself, she said without preamble. The crib. It took him 3 weeks. He started over twice. He was determined that it needed to be something he made, not something he bought. She paused. It's not level. It never was. Lillian won't care. Rhett said nothing. I think about what it cost him, she said, to be the kind of man who built his daughter a crib himself, badly, out of stubbornness and love, and then to make the choices he made, the debt, the silence, the way he arranged things at the end. Those things aren't contradictory. That's what I had to learn. People can love fiercely and still leave a mess. They can build you something beautiful and impractical and then fail you in the practical ways that matter. She turned around. Rhett was looking at the crib. The closed room, she said. In your house. You said you hadn't changed anything. I haven't. You should, she said. Not unkindly. Not as a directive. As the thing she actually believed. Not because forgetting is good or because moving on is something you owe anyone, but because keeping things frozen doesn't honor what they were. It just keeps you in the moment of losing them. She paused. Margaret didn't pick that color for the room so you could close the door on it forever. She picked it because she was getting ready for something. He was very still. I know, he said finally. What was the color? A pause. Yellow, he said. A specific yellow. She had a name for it. I don't remember the name. Something about mourning. She looked at him. That's a good color, she said. He exhaled slowly. I'll think about it, he said, which from him was nearly a commitment. She nodded and turned back to the room. I'm going to put Lillian in here tonight, she said, for the first time. I've been keeping her with me since she was born, but she needs her own room and I need... She stopped. You need to sleep, he said. I need to let her start being a person with her own space, she corrected. I need to let go of her just a little, even though the idea of it still makes something in my chest seize up. He understood. She could tell by the way he didn't try to fix it, didn't say it would get easier, didn't say it was the right thing, didn't reduce it to any of the comfortable assurances that people offer when the truth is more complicated. He just stood there and acknowledged that what she'd said was real. She was grateful for that. She was more grateful for him, generally, than she had found the right words for yet. He left on the 4th morning. She knew the night before that he was preparing to go, by the small signs of a man who has been a guest and is returning his borrowed space to its proper order, the way he folded the blanket from the spare cot, the way he checked the horses twice, the way he sat at the kitchen table after supper and was quieter than usual in the specific manner of someone who has something on their mind and is deciding whether to say it. She waited. She had gotten good at waiting for him. He always got there. "You'll be all right here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. The north fence is as solid as I can get it until the ground softens. The barn door will hold." "I know. I watched you do it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Victor's appeal," he said. "When it comes, I'll send word to Clara. She'll know how to reach you if I need." She stopped, started over. "If I want to tell you." He looked at her. "Either," he said. "If you need or if you want." She held his gaze. "Either," she agreed. A long pause. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was not him being withholding, but him being precise. A man who did not want to say the wrong thing badly enough that he sometimes said nothing at all. "You don't have to be careful with me," she said quietly. "Whatever you're trying to say, you can say it. I'm not fragile and I'm not in a hurry and I'm not going anywhere. I have a land ruling filed at the office and a child in that room down the hall and nowhere I need to be this morning except here." He set his coffee cup down. "I don't know what this is yet," he said. "Between us. I don't know what to call it or what to do with it. I know that I have thought about you every day since I found you on that trail, and not in a way I can organize into something simple. I know that going back to the ranch feels different than it did when I left it 3 weeks ago, because something has changed in how I understand what the ranch is for." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you so you know. Because you told me I could be honest." She looked at him for a long moment. "When I was on that trail," she said, "the night before you found me, I had Lillian in my arms, and I was so cold I had stopped feeling cold, which I knew was bad, and I made myself a promise. Not a dramatic one. Just, I told myself that if I got through it, I was going to stop arranging myself around what other people needed from me and start being honest about what I needed for myself." She paused. "What I needed for myself included getting to Ferris Bend and filing the will. It included not letting Victor Crane take my daughter." She looked at him steadily. "It also included not walking away from something real because the timing was inconvenient, or because I hadn't finished grieving, or because I was afraid of what it meant." He was very still. "I'm not finished grieving," she said. "I want to be honest about that. Thomas is still present in this house, and in this child, and in me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I don't think you're asking me to." "No," he said. "I'm not. And you're not finished either." "No." "Then we're two people who are not finished," she said, "who have somehow found each other on the same trail." He looked at her. She looked back. "Come back," she said. "When you've got the ranch settled, come back and we'll figure out what to call it." He picked up his coffee cup. He finished what was in it. "All right," he said. "Oh." He left an hour later. She stood on the front step and watched him ride east, and she did not feel the specific grief of watching someone disappear that she had braced for. She felt something different, the particular weight of something that has been set in motion and is now moving on its own terms, without requiring her to hold it up. She went inside. She picked up Lillian, who was awake in the crib in the yellow morning light that came through the east window. The light that Thomas's daughter had been waiting for, in this room he had built badly and lovingly, in this house that had nearly been taken and had not been taken. She held her daughter and looked out the window at the empty trail. Then she turned around and went to work. Victor Crane filed his appeal 6 weeks later. She found out by letter, forwarded from Harlow's office in Ferris Bend, which had received the county court's notice and passed it on as promised. The appeal was filed in Cutter's Creek on grounds that Harlow had applied an incorrect evidentiary standard. It was exactly what she had expected, in the time frame she had expected. She read the letter twice. Then she wrote 3 letters, one to Judge Harlow, one to Clara, and one to Rhett. To Harlow she wrote requesting guidance on the county court process and asking whether Dr. Greer's statement, already in the Ferris Bend record, could be submitted to the county court directly. To Clara she wrote with the news and a request to find out whether a lawyer in Ferris Bend might be willing to take a case on a deferred fee arrangement, given the documented merits. To Rhett she wrote last and longest. She told him about the appeal. She told him about what she'd been doing in the 6 weeks since he'd left, the work she'd done on the house, the arrangement she'd made with the Dolby family 2 farms over to share a milk cow through the winter, the morning 2 weeks ago when she'd walked into the barn and found a letter from Ruth Alderman waiting in the post, a a personal letter this time, rather than a legal one, offering to correspond and asking after Lillian. She told him she had opened the window in Lillian's room and the morning light came through it in exactly the right way. She told him she was not afraid of the appeal. She told him she missed the ranch. She stopped and looked at that sentence for a moment, because it was true, and she wanted to be sure she was letting it be true, rather than crossing it out. She left it. She sealed the letter and sent it with the postwriter the following morning. His reply came 11 days later. He wrote the way he talked, without preamble, without ornament, in the short direct sentences of a man who chose his words not for effect, but for accuracy. He had received the county court notice from her letter before one arrived separately from the court itself, which told him something about how she handled things that he already knew. He had written to a lawyer in Cutter's Creek named Birch, who had handled 2 similar cases and had a reputation for being harder to discourage than most. He had started on the closed room. Not finished, started. He had opened the door and aired it out and stood in it for a while and then left it open. He would come to Gristle Flats when the spring thaw cleared the East Trail. That would be approximately 6 weeks. He signed it with his name and nothing after it, which she found she preferred to any flourish he could have added. She read it standing in the kitchen in the morning light and then folded it and put it in the desk drawer where Thomas's account book lived, which was where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find again. Spring came the way it always does on the Montana plain, not gently, not all at once, but in the unpredictable way of a season that hasn't decided yet. A warm week followed by 2 cold days followed by rain that turned the trail to soup, and then a morning where the air was suddenly, undeniably different. The kind of morning where you go outside for no particular reason and stand in it for a moment because something in your body recognizes it before your mind does. Eliza was in the barn that morning, checking on the horse, when she heard the sound of hooves on the trail. She did not rush out. She finished what she was doing. She ran her hand down the horse's neck and gave her the piece of apple she'd brought, and walked to the barn door and looked out. Rhett was coming up the trail on Drum. He looked the same as he had in November, and different in the way that people look different after months have passed. Not older exactly, just more itself. More settled into the specific version of himself that he had been becoming since she'd known him. He stopped at the fence and got down. She walked out to meet him. They stood at the fence in the morning light and looked at each other, and whatever awkwardness might have been there in the months of distance wasn't there. She had thought it might be. She had prepared for the specific difficulty of beginning again after a long gap. But there was no gap, not really. They had been corresponding. They had been present to each other across the distance in the way that honest letters make possible. "The East Trail's clear," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Birch wrote me back," he said. "He'll take the case. The fee structure is—" "I got his letter too," she said. "We've already corresponded." He looked at her. "You've already corresponded," he said. He had a question about the original debt timeline. I was the one who could answer it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Of course." She almost smiled. "Come inside," she said. "Lillian is awake, and she'll want to see you." He tied Drum to the fence post and followed her up the path to the front door, and she pushed it open and went in, and the house that had been cold and still in November was warm now, and smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular lived-in quality that a house acquires when someone is actually inhabiting it rather than just surviving inside it. Lillian was in the crib in her room, awake and looking at the ceiling, the way she always did, with her watchful dark eyes and her small face arranged in the expression of a person taking careful inventory. Rhett appeared in the doorway. Lillian's eyes moved to him. She made the sound, the specific exhalation with shape that she made for things she recognized. She had made it for Eliza every morning since she was born. She had made it, once, in a dark kitchen in the middle of a Montana winter, for a man who held her against his chest and walked the floor until she slept. She made it now. Rhett crouched down to her level and let her look at him, and didn't rush it, and didn't reach for her until she had finished her inventory and determined, in whatever way that very small people determine things, that her conclusions were satisfied. Then he offered his hand and she wrapped her fingers around one of his and held on. He looked at her for a long moment. "She's changed," he said. "She does it constantly," Eliza said. "Every week there's something new. It's the most exhausting and astonishing thing I've ever experienced." "What's she doing that's new?" "She laughs now," Eliza said. "She started 3 weeks ago. Not often, But it's real. It's a real laugh, not gas, not reflex. She finds things funny. What things? Mostly the cat. Eliza paused. I got a cat. For the barn. She came inside approximately 1 day after I brought her home and has shown no interest in returning. Lillian thinks she's the most remarkable thing in existence. He looked at the baby. The baby looked at him. She has Thomas's eyes, he said. Yes, Eliza said simply. He stood up. They looked at each other in the doorway of the room that Thomas had built, and Eliza had kept, and Lillian now occupied with the thorough completeness of a small person who understands instinctively that this space belongs to her. The appeal hearing is in 8 weeks, Eliza said. Birch says we're well positioned. Harlow's ruling was documented thoroughly, and the physician's statement is strong. The county court tends to defer to the lower ruling when the documentation is clean. Tends to, Rhett said. There are no guarantees, she said. I've stopped expecting guarantees. What I expect is that we'll make the best case we can with what we have, and then we'll see. He looked at her. Are you scared? He asked. She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. Less than I was. The scared feeling used to be the loudest thing in the room. Now it's just one thing among several. What are the others? She considered. Determined, she said. Tired in the way that's different from exhaustion. The tired that comes from working towards something instead of running from something. That's a better kind. She paused. And she stopped. And? He said. She looked at him. Not alone, she said. He held her gaze. No, he said. Not alone. The appeal was heard in Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday in late April. Birch was everything his reputation had suggested. Not flashy, not theatrical, just relentlessly prepared in the way of a man who had learned that most cases are won in the reading room rather than the courtroom. He had located one of the out-of-territory witnesses named on the debt agreement, a man named Fowler who lived in Wyoming and who, when contacted, had provided a deposition that was more useful than anyone had expected. He had signed something for Victor Crane, he said, but it had not been what was described to him, and he had signed it as a personal favor, believing it to be a simple acknowledgement of a debt, not a legal instrument. It was not a confession of fraud on Victor's part, but it was a deposition from a named witness that did not support the agreement's terms. The county court judge was a woman named Aldian Price, who had been appointed 3 years prior and who had, in that time, developed a reputation for reading documents carefully and tolerating dramatics poorly. She read the documents carefully. She tolerated Victor's lawyer's theater poorly. She ruled in Eliza's favor within the same session, citing the lower court's thorough documentation and the new deposition as sufficient grounds to deny the appeal. She did not find fraud formally. That would have required a separate proceeding and a higher burden of proof. But she did note in her ruling that the debt agreement contained inconsistencies that warranted scrutiny, and she suggested that any future claims against the Vane property arising from the same instrument would face significant obstacles in her court. It was as close to done as it was going to be. Victor had one more avenue, the territorial court, but Birch told them quietly afterward that the cost and the evidence made it unlikely. Victor was a man who calculated returns. The return on this investment had been declining since February, and men like Victor, whatever their flaws, were not irrational. They knew when a position had been lost. Eliza stood outside the courthouse in Cutter's Creek in the April afternoon and let herself feel it fully, the way she had not let herself feel the Ferris Bend ruling because that one had still had appeals ahead of it. This one did not. Rhett stood beside her. Clara had come for the hearing. She and Wheat had made the trip, and Wheat had looked at the whole proceeding with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does not say much, but takes pleasure in watching justice arrive, however slowly. Clara hugged Eliza without saying anything, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. Wheat shook Rhett's hand, and the handshake was brief and solid in the way of men who have decided they understand each other without requiring much ceremony to establish it. Then Clara and Wheat went to find the hotel, because they were staying overnight before the return trip, and Eliza and Rhett stood alone on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon light, and the air smelled like mud and green things, and the specific scent of a Montana spring that is still cold but is no longer pretending to be winter. "It's done," she said. "Mostly," he said. "Mostly," she agreed. "Victor still exists. He still has money. He might still try something someday through some other avenue. Yes. But not this, she said. Not this specific thing. This he cannot take. She looked out at the street. I've been thinking, she said, about what comes next. Not the legal things. I understand the legal things now better than I ever wanted to. I mean, what I build from here. What have you been thinking? The land is good, she said. Better than Thomas managed to make use of, partly because he was stretched thin and partly because he was cautious in the wrong ways. There's room to expand the cattle operation. The grazing on the east side of the property hasn't been properly worked in years. She paused. I've also been thinking about the ranch. He looked at her. Your ranch, she said. It's 30 miles east of my land. That's not a short distance, but it's not an uncrossable one. No, he said. It's not. You have good land, she said. I've seen what you've built on it. But you've been running it alone for 4 years, and it shows. Not in the quality of what you've done, but in the scope of what hasn't been done, because there was only one person to do it. She paused. And I have good land, and I'm running it alone, and I have an infant daughter and a cat who refuses to live in the barn. He looked at her for a long moment. Eliza, he said. I'm not proposing anything tonight, she said. I'm thinking out loud. I'm saying that 2 pieces of land and 2 people and a child who already knows your face might constitute the beginning of something worth considering. Something worth considering, he repeated. At whatever pace makes sense, she said. I am not in a hurry. I told you that in November, and it's still true. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I want, but I'm also not going to push it before it's ready. He turned to look at the street, the way he did when he was processing something, when he needed the middle distance to organize his thoughts. You know what I thought, he said slowly, when I found you on the trail? Tell me. I thought, this woman is going to die on this trail, and I am the only person in a position to stop that from happening, and I should stop it. He paused. That's all it was. It was a simple thing, someone in trouble, someone who could help. And then, she said, and then you told me you could walk, he said. And you did. And I thought, this is not a woman who needed rescuing. This is a woman who needed one person to stand close enough that the cold didn't kill her before she could get where she was going herself. She looked at him. That's what I needed, she said. That's exactly what I needed. I know, he said. I knew it then, in the practical sense. It took me longer to understand what it meant. What does it mean? He turned to look at her. It means I don't want to be the person who saves you, he said. I want to be the person who stands close enough that you don't have to do it in the cold. She felt something move through her, not a rush, not the dramatic swell of something uncomplicated, something quieter and more durable than that, the feeling of a thing being named correctly for the first time. That's a good way to say it, she said. I've been working on it since February, he said. She laughed, real, unplanned, the kind that came from somewhere below strategy. He smiled, an actual smile, not the ghost of one, not the precursor, but the full thing, which she had seen only a handful of times and which changed his face in a way she found she wanted to keep seeing. Come back to Gristle Flats, she said, when she'd caught her breath. Stay through spring, help me assess the east grazing, then we'll figure out the rest. All right, he said. She offered her hand, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just the practical extension of an arm towards someone she trusted. He took it. They stood on the courthouse steps in Cutter's Creek in the late April afternoon and held on. And the street below them was ordinary and muddy and real, and the territory spread out in every direction with its distances and its difficulties and its specific unforgiving beauty, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that needed to be said right then. The things that happened after that happened slowly, the way real things do. The appeal was never filed at the territorial level. Victor Crane turned his attention to other interests, other properties, other calculations. He was not defeated in the dramatic sense. He did not confess. He was not arrested. He did not appear at Eliza's door to apologize or concede. He simply withdrew, the way men withdraw when a position has stopped being worth the cost of holding it. Eliza watched for the next attempt for a long time, because she had learned not to assume she had seen the last of a particular kind of man. But the next attempt did not come. Eventually, she stopped watching for it, not because she forgot, but because she had more important things to look toward. Rhett Hawthorne stayed through spring, then through summer. They worked the east grazing together and found it to be as good as Eliza had thought. Better, in the sections that had been let go longest once the grasses came back. They made 3 trips between Gristle Flats and the Hawthorne Ranch that summer, each one necessary for different reasons. Supplies, the cattle that needed to be moved, a boundary survey that Rhett had been putting off for 2 years and that Eliza insisted on doing properly. He opened the room. She knew because he told her in a letter in June that he had repainted it, not yellow exactly, but a color adjacent to yellow, and that he had left the window open for a week to let the old air out, and that it felt different now. Not empty. Not a wound. Just a room. She wrote back that she was glad. She meant it. Lillian grew. She grew the way Eliza had hoped she would. Not fast. Not alarming. Just steadily. Accumulating herself in the way of children who are well-loved and well-watched and sufficiently challenged by the world around them. She laughed often by summer. She had opinions about the cat. She regarded Rhett with the same steady attention she gave to everything, and sometime in July, Eliza could not have named the exact day, that attention shifted from watchfulness to something more like affection, the specific affection of a small person who has decided that someone is safe. He noticed. She could tell by the way he was with Lillian after that, still careful, still not assuming, but something lighter in it. They married the following spring. Not in a church, because Eliza had never been someone for whom ceremony was the point, and because Rhett's relationship to formal occasions was complicated at best. They married in Harlow's office in Ferris Bend with Clara and Wheat as witnesses, on a Tuesday in March when the trail was clear and the light was doing the thing it did in late winter when the angle shifts and everything looks briefly like it's being illuminated from inside. It was not perfect. Eliza wore a dress she had altered herself from one she already owned, and the alteration was competent but not elegant. Rhett said his vows in the flat, direct way he said everything, which she preferred to any performance of feeling he might have given instead. Lillian, 14 months old and walking with the new determination of a child who has recently discovered the power of locomotion, spent most of the ceremony trying to reach the window latch, and Clara spent most of the ceremony trying to redirect her, with limited success. Harlow pronounced them married with the mild satisfaction of a man who had seen the preceding year of this story and found the current chapter appropriate. Clara cried, which she had said she would not do and which no one was surprised by. Wheat shook Rhett's hand again, the same handshake as before, solid and brief, with slightly more warmth in it this time. Eliza and Rhett looked at each other across the small official room, and she thought about a storm in November and a frozen trail and the specific choice of stopping, the choice a man makes, or doesn't, when he sees something that will cost him nothing to ignore and everything to address. He had stopped. She had walked. And here they were. There is a thing people say about love on the frontier, that it is practical above all else, that it is built from necessity and proximity and the simple arithmetic of survival. And there is truth in that, more than romance likes to admit. The people who built lives in those territories were not building them from sentiment. They were building them from the available materials, in the available weather, with whatever they had managed to carry or find or make. But here's what the practical explanation leaves out. It leaves out the moment a man gets down from his horse in a snowstorm, not because he has calculated the odds, but because something in him recognizes something in the woman standing in front of him, and the recognition is faster than reason. It leaves out the way a woman, exhausted and frightened and carrying everything alone, accepts help in the only way she can, by not accepting it entirely, by insisting on walking herself, by keeping the last piece of control, because without it, she is only a body in a storm, and not the person she is still fighting to be. It leaves out the closed rooms, and the photographs kept in books, and the grief that does not resolve but changes shape as time passes, becoming not smaller but more livable. The way a scar becomes part of the body, rather than an injury to it. It leaves out Lillian, who grew up on 2 pieces of land and knew both as home, who learned to ride before she was 4 and to read before she was 6, and who had her mother's directness and her father's, Thomas's, patience, and something else that was entirely her own, something she brought with her out of that storm, wrapped in 2 blankets against her mother's chest. The Hawthorne Ranch and the Vane property were combined eventually, not through legal merger but through the simpler merger of 2 households, deciding that 30 miles was farther than it needed to be. The east grazing proved as valuable as Eliza had said, and the ranch expanded over the following years into one of the more stable operations in that part of the territory, Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the kind of operation that holds because it was built by people who understood what they were building and why. The town of Gristle Flats watched this happen. Towns watch. People talk. The story of the widow who walked 30 miles in a storm with a newborn was told and retold, and with each telling it became slightly more extraordinary than it had actually been, which is the way stories go. What did not change in the telling, what remained consistent across all the versions Eliza eventually heard, was this. She had come back. She had not been driven out. She had walked out under pressure and come back under her own power, with a document in her hand and her daughter in her arms, and a man beside her who had the sense to stand next to her rather than in front of her. The town had seen a lot of things in its years on the Montana plain. It had not seen that exact configuration before. It remembered. Eliza remembered too. All of it, in the specific detail of someone who has learned that the things that nearly broke you are also the things that show you what you're made of. She did not romanticize what had happened. She knew how close it had come. She knew that a different storm, a different trail, a different man on a different horse, and the story ended in a ditch somewhere north of nowhere with two people who never got where they were going. She did not take the version that had actually happened for granted. She held Lillian on the step of the ranch house one October evening, years later, watching the light go down over the western ridge, in the way it did in autumn when the angle made everything look briefly gold. Lillian was 5 by then, and too old and too particular to be held for long, but she allowed it for a few minutes, leaning back against her mother with the specific trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt the arms holding her. "Tell me about the storm," Lillian said. She asked this the way children ask for familiar stories, not because they don't know the ending, but because they want the comfort of hearing it again. "It was very cold," Eliza said, "and you were walking. I was walking, and I was carrying you. And then what?" "And then a man stopped his horse," Eliza said, "and he got down, and he walked with us." "Why?" Lillian asked. The serious question that she returned to every time, the one that had been puzzling her for years in the gradual way that children puzzle over things until the answer assembles itself. Eliza thought about it honestly, the way she always did. "Because he could," she said, "and because he didn't look away." Lillian considered this. "Is that enough?" she asked. "Just not looking away?" Eliza looked out at the ridge, at the gold light, at the land that had been nearly taken and had not been taken. "Sometimes," she said, "it's everything." Lillian settled back against her, satisfied for now. The light moved across the ridge and faded, the way light does, indifferent to whether anyone is watching, performing nothing, simply present in its moment and then gone. And the ranch held them, as it had held them from the beginning, imperfectly, practically, in the unglamorous way of things built to last rather than things built to impress. And the evening came on, and the lamps were lit inside, and the door was open, and from somewhere in the house came the sound of Rhett's voice, which had never been a voice for speeches or declarations, calling them in for supper. They went in.